This is the second panel of the day. This is European energy security, new tools and policies. So obviously we've talked about energy security at a very high level today. We've talked about it globally. We've talked about the transatlantic relationship. With our panelists, we're going to sort of dive into the European energy security landscape with a bit more detail and look at some of the interacting energy markets and some of the changes going on there. I've got an excellent panel. So to start off, to my left, I've got Ben McWilliams, a fellow at Bruegel, a Brussels-based think tank that is doing, I think, a lot of the best work on sort of the energy security crisis that happened over the last few years, the economic ramifications, and now moving out of that, looking ahead to the long-term sort of picture for European energy, which I think is crucial work. Next, I have Emily Holland, who's assistant professor at the Naval War College, who's done a lot of fantastic work on the intersection of natural gas, policy making in Europe and Russia, and now is the deputy political advisor for critical infrastructure at NATO. And so she's going to have a lot of interesting things to say about some of the infrastructure challenges here. And then joining remotely from across the pond, we have Andrei Kovitru, who is the climate policy advisor to the chairman and CEO at PPC, who we heard from earlier today. And so once again, is going to have a lot of insight into some of the commercial and dynamics in the European electricity sector. So thank you all for joining. Really looking forward to this. A few opening notes. I think we think about energy security in Europe. We think about Russia. I think we could probably safely say that vis-a-vis Russia, European energy security has improved in the sense that the gas weapon has been used. It can't be used again, really. So we might think that European energy security is structurally in a better place. Perhaps that's true in some dimensions. On the flip side, of course, the response to that has been new infrastructure, new suppliers, new technologies, new commercial dynamics. And so I would just introduce the idea that rather than structurally improved energy security, we are now moving to just a different energy security landscape that's going to require making sure we are vigilant about where and what those risks are. And then I think in particular, we want to think about the intersection of different fuels and different energy sources. And so once again, natural gas is on everyone's mind, but the crisis of the last several years showed in particular the relationship between natural gas and electricity. You can't think of those two things independently. They are one and the same in some really deep sense. Those two markets are linked, the technologies are linked, the policy decisions are linked, the commercial and geopolitical relationships are linked. If you want to think about coal, you want to think about LNG, you want to think about nuclear, any of these fuels, any of these, or you want to think about technologies, EVs, solar panels. All of this works within one combined energy ecosystem, and policy decisions in one subsector impact the demands on the other. So we just have to keep in mind sort of that synthesis perspective. I'm going to start just by opening it up here to Ben. As you look at Europe, my opening theme, which is the shifting risk. Where for you is the new risk? Where for you is the structural sort of concern as you look at Europe as a whole?
Thanks, Sai, and thanks to the CSIS for the invitation. It's very nice to be here. For Europe's energy risk, I think coming out of the gas crisis, the situation there is much calmer than it has been in the past, as people have discussed this morning. I think one key risk and hangover from that is the impact on industrial outputs in Europe, which is very depressed. And even as prices have come down in the last 6 months, industrial output in Europe hasn't resumed. It's stayed where it used to be, which, I mean, I'm an economist, and lots of these energy-intensive industries, I question the relative merits of them being in certain places in Europe, and it probably makes sense. This is a structural adjustment. On the other hand, that's hard. Societally and politically, we have European elections coming up in just a couple of months. We have national elections all around Europe, and this kind of hangover and hit on industrial activity, I think, is a serious concern, something to think more about. And moving forwards and thinking about Europe's energy security risks, at least me personally, that's the way I kind of think of these future energy security risks is through products, through manufactured products, where in Europe it's not clear what share of future manufactured products we will have. Both energy intensive things like aluminium, steel, fertilizers, but also, which are also energy intensive, solar panels and electric vehicles, which are critical for enabling the transition. And there Europe is stuck in this middle ground between both China and the US, where like the US, we feel the threats of China and the fact that China dominates so many of these value chains. But also there's a perception in Europe of a slight threat from the Inflation Reduction Act. That's not a mystery or a secret from people here. And you know, trying to define this industrial strategy in Europe of what we want to produce and how we want to produce it in this global competition between America and China, where we have a European Union of 27 member states trying to think of an industrial strategy is a really hard thing to do, to get kind of unanimous agreement among these 27 countries. And in my mind, that's the kind of shaping energy and climate question of the day. We have in Europe, we've asked 2 former Italian prime ministers to write reports on this. One of them, Enrico Letta, has published it. Mario Draghi will publish soon. After the new Parliament and Commission takes office, there will be an industrial strategy document published. And for me, that's the question. Thinking through balancing the fact that Europe is energy poor in both gas and oil and will likely still be energy poor in a world of renewables. Balancing that and the kind of the economic efficiencies that we would get from, you know, from greater trade of these goods with the security of supply risk on those products is the challenge. Finding that balance and not overthinking it. Someone on the panel this morning mentioned, I mean, the import of solar panels or electric vehicles is not at all comparable to the import of gas or oil. If one's interrupted, it doesn't have the same impact. But, you know, having lived through the crisis in Europe, people think in those terms sometimes, that when they have discussions, they're still having this fresh in their mind, the interruption of Russian gas. So balancing out this security of supply on manufactured products that are typically energy intensive, for me, I think is in my mind, one of, or if not the defining question for Europe's energy policy moving forward.
Yeah, so the arc of demand and the composition of demand and the geographic distribution of demand within Europe is obviously determines the supply requirements. It determines the infrastructure requirements, but it's politically complicated. It's not an economic question per se. It is fundamentally a political one, and those political sort of dynamics, I think, are going to be consistently challenging. Emily, talking about political dynamics, I'm thinking about infrastructure. Obviously, getting infrastructure built is a politically challenging issue. But I think I'm just curious, you know, infrastructure, unlike fuel, it sits for a long time. Once you build it, it's there for 30, 40, 50 years. A transmission line can last for 50 plus years, 60, 70 years. Gas pipelines, decades. So, you know, as Europe sort of invests in new classes of infrastructure, how should it think about okay, we're shifting away from fuel exposure, but we are creating new security risks. And how are you, and I guess how is NATO thinking about that?
Well, I think one of the major impacts, of course, from Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a complete transformation in the way Europe is getting its fuel, right? So we have drastically reduced Russian pipeline gas, so that means an increase in LNG. Well, LNG comes from a completely different way. It's not piped over large swaths of land. It comes via boat. It has to go to regasification terminals. There's a whole new set of infrastructure. Not only that, but then you have increased maritime presence. You have more important and much more frequent shipments of LNG coming through now quite contested waters in the North Sea, through the Baltic Sea. So there's a whole host of challenges with just the shift of how Europe is getting its fuel. On the NATO side, it's very challenging because much of this infrastructure is not owned by the EU or NATO or even the states themselves. They're owned by private companies and consortiums. So dealing with how to protect something that not even a state owns, but a variety of different companies that are based in different states is a huge challenge. How do we police that? How do we investigate incidents? How do we convince insurers and private sector actors that we can police and protect these things is a huge challenge because there are so many different actors involved. So I think what NATO is looking at right now is trying to figure out how best can we respond, what is the best way to organize ourselves to respond and protect to attacks, which we've seen are very difficult to attribute. And the problem with much of this infrastructure is that it is very vulnerable. We obviously saw this with Russia, or with the explosion of Nord Stream, but we see it all the time with smaller cables, smaller pipelines. Something as simple as an anchor drag can completely disrupt very serious and important critical infrastructure. That's hard to police. We don't have enough physical assets to be patrolling all of these things at once. What we have often viewed now is we can see like Russian Navy vessels patrolling their own infrastructure. So we see boats sort of going along different undersea pipelines and cables, and you don't want to engage. We're not at war with Russia. NATO is not at war with Russia. So these are really tricky challenges. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we see is how do we integrate the private sector? And that, to me, has been NATO's biggest challenge right now. How do we integrate the private sector? How do we convince them to keep investing, to keep building resilience? Because one of the big lessons that came out of the energy crisis, and that still is coming, is that we did not have enough resilience in terms of our energy infrastructure, in terms of our grids. Things could very easily come down, and that's not energy security, right? Not having any resilience is not energy security. So we need to build overcapacity, and to do that, we need to convince the private sector and insurers to keep building these assets.
Yeah, and that sounds vaguely expensive, so which I think we'll probably come to. Andre, I guess same question to you, but obviously you're at PPC, you're inside the electric sector. You're thinking about the relationship between your customer base, your national government, and then of course you've got you're thinking about the European perspective. You're thinking about the sort of common European objectives as it relates to energy security, but you have to deal with the folks that you have responsibilities to. So I guess to you, where is the energy security risk going, and what is the role of PPC in that sort of conversation?
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes.
From Brussels. So before going specifically into your question, which I think is critical and important, let me zoom out just a bit, because I think it's important to maybe connect a bit with the topic of our panel, right? So it's tools and policies for addressing energy security. And I think to properly identify what are the right tools and measures and policies to do that, I think, in my view, we need to respond to two critical questions at the moment. The first one is, what is energy security today and how we are defining it? And I know you have a dedicated panel on that coming up next, so I don't want to spoil the fun. But I think it's important to, I won't. But it's important to remember what we ought to consider as affecting or improving energy security, right? So as the chairman was mentioning at the beginning of the event, we are talking about layers of energy security nowadays. So for centuries, we had domestic resources that were meeting domestic demand. Then in the second part of the 20th century, we have more physical and commercial ties with countries that have an abundance of that. And I think we can all agree that this is the moment when geopolitics of energy kind of started. And we've seen the limits of that over the past few years with Russian gas imported in Europe, but we've also seen in this layer a solution with US LNG supporting the security of supply in Europe. And now we have another layer, a third layer, if you want, of clean technologies, both on the supply and the demand side, which is highly obviously dependent on critical raw materials and clean manufacturing. We know that. But I think the combination of these layers is actually generating different energy security definitions for each geography, because we are having very different starting points. But geopolitics of tomorrow, with this renewables picking up, will arguably be less tense, because we will have more local production. So the destination, when we will have a peak of this local generation, will be less geopolitically tense, but the journey towards that will be very complicated, which actually leads me to my second critical question. And Ben was very rightly so referring to that in his part, who are we partnering up with? So, as you know, John Hertz defined in 1950 the security dilemma, right? So when one state increases its security, that leads to the other states to see that and to fear that and to increase their own security capacity. So in that sense, I think we are now living a moment in which we can define what is happening as a energy security dilemma, with countries investing in their energy security systems and frameworks. And to this end, I think we will need to understand who are our trusted and like-minded partners, because a too fragmented, let's say, way of rebuilding our energy security will not give us the full benefits of the energy transition, of economies of scale, of lower energy bills, and it will also not solve the climate change. And for that reason, I think the US and the EU partnership is probably more important than ever. Which basically leads me to your question, Sai. So I think it's important to understand that what happened over the past few years in Europe, of course, started from the gas prices picking up, from the Russian gas prices that were increasing, and that also took advantage, like Emily mentioned, of the low resilience that the energy system had, and probably not a very well-functioning energy market design. And we've seen some coordinated efforts over the past few years on that. But I think the solution, what actually solved, quote unquote, the electricity crisis, was not necessarily the innovative policies that we put in place, because they are not necessarily new and they are not silver bullets. But it's actually what has been mentioned also in the previous panel. So US LNG gas being imported in Europe, new suppliers for gas, solutions, infrastructure that you mentioned, but also on the other side, as Ben was highlighting, also some significant demand reduction or even destruction at some point. So as you mentioned, infrastructure and security of supply go hand in hand, but we need to understand and to respond to these two critical questions, in my view, in order to find the right policies and tools to address that.
So, you've mentioned, commercial partners, finding commercial partners, and then also, but they have to be trusted. And because these are going to be the bedrocks of our energy security. It's not going to be, if a fragmented equilibrium is like sort of a suboptimal equilibrium. That's probably true, globally, but certainly within Europe as well. And the energy security dilemma is really interesting as it relates to, let's say, the electricity sector, where, it's still national. Each country has its own sort of priorities within its borders about how it's going to produce its electricity. But of course, it's far more optimal to integrate, to share resources, to move power across the continent. So I'd love to just sort of maybe explore this challenge in particular, this integration challenge for Europe in particular, because it seems to be a key pillar of a secure energy future, and yet presumably challenging. First, I'll throw it right back to you, Andre. Can you just talk a little bit about transmission? I know Greece has plans to integrate with its neighbors. Is it, how much transmission is needed? What is the risk of sort of underbuilding transmission, and what are the blocks there?
So I think grids in general, both distribution and transmission, are a common problem across geography. So I think in the US we have more or less the same issue. We have that in Europe as well. And before addressing what I see as being the barriers, let me tell you that I think on the transmission, at least on the transmission side, I think we are talking about a hidden gem here, because if we were to actually ramp up investments in transmission, we would basically convert this intermittence that we have from renewable generation in some places more to a base load like energy, because we will be able to transport it in some other regions that have a deficit, and vice versa, right? So when it comes to the barriers to ramping up that, I think cost is obviously something that comes into play quite easily, and that's the reason why we are not seeing so immediate, let's say, action in that sense. Everything has been passed to the transmission and distribution tariffs in the past because they are natural monopolies, these operators. But obviously, there are limits to how much politically this can be converted into tariffs. So I think we need to look into other solutions and other policies to address that. But that would be the first time we will be doing that in Europe and also in the US as well, because adding some additional funds to the distribution and transmission tariffs is something that hasn't been done before. So it's not that easy, even if we were to identify the money to do that. And then I think the deployment time is also an issue. Permitting, both in the US and the EU, is quite a significant, let's say, barrier. And in order to meet 2030, 2040 demand and targets, I think transmission needs to, investment in transmission and distribution would need to speed up in order to actually have or to keep, let's say, these targets in sight.
Ben, you know, Andre mentions cost. I think cost is, you know, in the U.S., cost allocation, we call it cost allocation. It's the chief barrier to expanding transmission. In my opinion, that is. In Europe, you know, cost allocation comes from, the challenge around this comes from different states having different visions for their own energy futures. And that those different energy futures include sort of visions for their industrial bases and policy. Can you just sort of talk about some of the, I guess I would say, intra-European tensions at play that make this challenging, you know, across the various divides and member states? Because I think it's sort of easy to think, well, we have European unity in the face of, you know, Russian aggression as it relates to some of the response over the last several years. You know, where does that, what does that run up into when it comes to something like a large-scale transmission build-out?
Sure, thanks. Indeed, I think for me that's perhaps the main challenge with transmission build-outs is it's very clear that building out transmission is a win for Europe. You know, it's a net positive. You need less capacity, less storage, lower deployment of renewables, but you create winners and losers. And that's the challenge. How do you balance off these trade-offs? A very concrete one is France, and the connection between the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, Portugal, through France into Germany, gas and electricity. And Spain they have the biggest LNG capacity in Europe, and it was sitting there unused for the whole of the crisis, and no progress was made on the gas pipeline from Spain through France to Germany. I think in the coming years, the priority now is electricity, not so much the gas pipelines. But again, the connection from the Iberian Peninsula into kind of the heart of European manufacturing in Germany is tiny. And that's, I mean, the concern. We're going to deploy a lot of solar, a lot of wind in Spain. There's a lot of abundant land resources, and that's going ahead. And there's no compromise being found here on building out pipelines, which is a problem, and it will fragment Europe. It will mean that your industrial facilities, you should go to Spain. If you're an energy-intensive producer right now, I would be looking at Spain and trying to make an agreement how I can get in there. Very soon, they're going to have, in many hours of the year, abundant capacity. They're going to have more solar and wind than their demand is. So I think that's a big challenge. And then for France with the nuclear, I mean, that's a big question for them, right? I mean, they sit in the middle, and if they kind of allow unfettered access to their market of renewables spiking and going down every few hours, what does that mean for this plan of building out another 20 gigawatt or so of nuclear that you want to just be running constantly on base load? So there's a huge problem there, and it's at the top of the political agenda. In Europe, I think Enrico Letta in his report and Mario Draghi again will emphasize it, and they'll put it on the table of policymakers. So Europe's aware of it and wants to do better. But at the moment, we haven't really got the solutions. And just one more point to throw out, which came from listening to Andre, is on the nature of electricity tariffs and the fact that at the moment we recoup costs for transmission, but also for things like contracts for difference, for building out solar and wind. We recoup them on electricity bills, and we recoup them largely from households. So we exempt typically energy intensive and companies from this recoupment of payments, which made sense for many years. But now, going forward, we're about to put a carbon tax on households in Europe, and we're asking them to switch to heat pumps, to deploy heat pumps and consume more and more electricity yet at the same time, as we build up more transmission and more renewables, we lump the costs of electricity on them, which is a little bit irrational. And I mean, one argument we're pushing is shifting away from electricity tariffs towards national budgets and just general taxation to fund these kind of things, to remove this strange incentive behavior.
Yeah, it's deeply challenging. The sort of the pile up of costs from what's, you know, at first glance might appear to be different projects, different priorities, and all the money filters down somewhere and piles up on costs. Emily, can you just sort of talk about how you think, you know, national policymakers sort of are responding to that? What are they facing? And again, how does that shape the sort of the energy union possibilities?
Yeah, so there's two sort of related challenges that relate to financing that I think are quite concerning. So the first is that, as you know, as Europe is moving towards clean energy technology, it's still a reality that fossil fuels, and particularly liquefied natural gas, are going to remain the pillar of the European energy mix for quite some time. So a challenge there is when you are saying to your investors, we are going to phase out natural gas by, I think Repower EU has some magic thinking like 2030, not going to happen, but saying that's going to happen. How do you convince investors to lay out large capital expenditures on infrastructure for a fuel that you say we're no longer going to use, or they're going to be banned, right? So that's a kind of structural challenge that we haven't really figured out how to manage yet. You know, states are signing 15-year-long deals for LNG. I think Germany just signed one with the UAE the other day for another 15-year-long deal. So these are, you know, not short periods of time, but if you look at it in terms of energy infrastructure, that's actually a pretty short time horizon. I mean, when companies are building gas pipelines, they're looking 30, 40, 50, 60 years, right, to recoup these sort of long-term investments. And that's why the European system, natural gas system of long-term contracts sort of came into being, was to support the structure of capital expenditures on infrastructure. So now we're looking at much shorter timelines. And industry has to figure out, how do we invest in these sorts of things, knowing that we have a much shorter time horizon. Now, relatedly to that is that's on the hydrocarbon side. On the other side, we know that the EU needs to incentivize clean energy technology. Well, that's great. How will it pay for the accelerated green energy transition? There are many different projects. There's, you know, the EU's Next Generation EU, which is this financing project which came out in 2021. It's due to expire in 2026. And that was basically a mix of grants and loans for each member state, with the money raised through joint EU debt. Speaking to what Ben was saying, there's some disagreements among the states about if they'd like to continue this, right? Some EU states don't believe in public joint financing and debt, Germany for one. There are concerns by smaller states that this will mean that the bigger states like France and Germany will have an outsized voice if they are doing most of the fundraising. But the challenge is, how is it going to pay for these things? There's a lot of programs, there's a lot of challenges, but there's not a lot of money. And particularly right now, the biggest challenge is that all of this money that we want to earmark for the clean energy transition is actually also in demand for defense spending. And in this current atmosphere, most of the money is going to be allocated towards defense spending. And so what happens to those very lofty goals in terms of bringing clean energy, technology, production, and transmission to the continent? So far, there's not really a consensus on how that's going to be paid for.
Andre, you brought up this cost point. So I'm curious what you think about sort of some of the, I guess you talked about sort of innovation in terms of how to fund projects, and I'm curious in the utility space, what is the best sort of solutions set to sort of figure out ways to solve what is essentially a missing money problem? You know, and I guess that assumes, probably that means in attracting private dollars into the ecosystem. So curious from the utility perspective what that looks like.
I'd love to give you one specific answer, but there's no silver bullet, I guess, and my fellow panelists, I think they agree with me. There's no silver bullet, and we have very different starting points when it comes to member states, and there's also not a secret sauce, if you want to keep the analogy. So there are very different tools that we could use and we should use, but we need to look also, and I think Ben was mentioning that at the beginning, at the political, let's say, context. So Over the past 2 years, Europe had quite a limited, I would say, time to put forward some adaptation measures to deal with the crisis. What is next after this year, after the elections, both in the EU and the US, that are important for the European Union, will basically put the framework forward for what is coming in the next few years. And this next commission will end its mandate just a few months from the 2030 targets, which are, some of them are quite ambitious. And I think this is the moment when we need to find the right elements and the right tools to actually implement some of these policies and these files that we put forward. Now, coming back to that, of course, we need to look into how to speed up renewable generation while ensuring reliability of supply. That is critical, and that is the conundrum that we need to look at. But at the same time, I think it's critical, coming back to your initial point, it's critical to look at infrastructure, whether or not infrastructure is ready today to accommodate for this transition. Whether or not we will have a very fast-paced transition towards renewable, or not so fast, but still a transition towards renewable, that is important, but I think we need to have the backbone first. And that is where I think we are lacking, or lagging behind, if you want, in terms of investments and in terms of needs to accommodate for this new, let's say, energy ecosystem that would include both the intermittent generation as well as a more flexible and more adapted demand, as well as some digital tools and digital platforms that would somehow unlock system efficiency. So I still think that grids is probably the number one topic that we need to look at, both in terms of financing and in terms of deployment. Let's not forget, we are not performing very well when it comes to the lead time of deploying this infrastructure. So that is probably the first, the get-go, let's say, element that we need to take care of, and then look at all the others that are equally urgent, of course.
We're sort of circling, sort of intra-EU, intra-European challenges. I want to, which I think is sort of perhaps underappreciated, as like a source of geopolitical tensions. But of course, the traditional sort of perspective is thinking Europe exposure internationally. And so I want to just shift that way. We've talked about the EU-US relationship. Andre has sort of really clearly mentioned the importance of US LNG. I'd be curious, first on maybe perhaps natural gas, but also electricity, some of the new corridors being opened up from Europe. I'm thinking in particular to the south, to North Africa, to the Middle East, to the Caucasus. What should we expect from those relationships? Emily, I guess I'll throw this to you. And what are the sort of the new sources of risk that invites and that European policymakers need to consider?
So I think the biggest difference, if we're going to compare the risks that Europe is sustaining now in terms of dependency with these new relationships, as opposed to comparing it to its relationship with Russia, is that LNG trade creates a very different set of factors in terms of dependence, right? So one of the reasons why dependence was so serious on Russia was because of these long-term contracts and because it was fixed pipeline infrastructure via land that there wasn't a lot of alternatives for, right? But we know now LNG is much more flexible, right? You have infrastructure that can accommodate LNG from multiple different sources, right? So the dependency on any one source now is just not as great in terms of just the number of suppliers. There are a lot more, but also just the physical properties of LNG is totally different. So the risk is a lot less, and we can't look at it in terms of the same sort of like traditional energy security dependence that we thought about with Russia in terms of natural gas. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't risks, right? So opening up to increased supply from, let's just take North Africa as an example. Well, North Africa as a source of energy has been problematic for a number of years because of the serious political instability that comes in some of these states. I mean, we had some North African states actually just stop exporting altogether because of political risk, and that has not changed at all. Like, that has not been ameliorated in any meaningful sense. Then, of course, you have increased natural gas deals with Middle Eastern suppliers. There, the political risk is not as inherent as it is in North Africa, but there is competition, right? So one of the things about the Russian natural gas trade was, yes, there was a lot of dependence, but there also wasn't competition because Russia was taking gas out of the ground in Russia, putting it in a pipeline and sending it to Europe. Now LNG can be traded all over the world. And so there is just there's a lot more buyers, there's a lot of people wanting LNG can go all around the world, and Europe will pay more for it, but it doesn't mean that other people don't need it as much. So it creates other sort of negative externalities. One of the kind of consequences of the energy crisis was that that Europe was paying so much more for liquefied natural gas, and that was driving up prices so that non-premium Asian markets could no longer afford to pay for that. And that has caused serious energy crises in, say, Pakistan, which still has rolling blackouts, I think, for 8 hours a day, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. So there's sort of externalities that have changed, the dependencies have changed, but there's still a lot of risk and problems inherent with new suppliers.
Yeah, we should sort of keep in mind the way sort of geopolitical considerations cascade and show up in insidious ways, sort of like, so like that has shifted the relationship with Europe's relationship with the global south, let's say, was like sort of, I think in many ways that those exact sort of examples have sort of perhaps entered into the climate conversation. Okay, so now you want to get together a COP and you want to talk about climate. Well, these decisions on the energy side or in an energy crisis cascade through and show up in the ways that are sort of like maybe you wouldn't expect. And so important to keep that in mind. Ben, there's another fuel that we're sort of, I think Europe talks a lot about. I don't know much about, I'm sort of unsure of, and that would be hydrogen. It seems to be a new tool. It's been characterized as a Swiss Army knife. What is Europe thinking about hydrogen? And I mean, and then after that, I think maybe we'll talk about the way hydrogen interacts with natural gas. But just characterize why and how Europe's thinking about hydrogen.
For those who follow hydrogen, I'm more in the kind of Michael Liebrich hydrogen ladder world, so that frames my remarks. I mean, so in 2020, Europe launched its hydrogen strategy, and here hydrogen was really about integrating electricity markets, so balancing kind of the 2-3 weeks of the year in the winter when you've got low renewable output, and doing things around the edges, so helping to decarbonize the production of fertilizers where you certainly need hydrogen, potentially some transport applications, but very niche where potentially the size of battery wouldn't be able to do it. That's where we began in 2020. In 2022, all of a sudden with the energy crisis and Russia's invasion, the European Commission was pushed to publish a document which Emily mentioned, the Repower EU strategy, and there they were given the political mandate, how can we have no Russian gas by 2027? And they were given 3 weeks to kind of write this document up, and it's a team of like 10 people who we also spoke with at the time, and yeah, they were a bit stressed. and there all of a sudden hydrogen took on a new role. It wasn't just about decarbonizing around the edges, it was about molecule for molecule replacing natural gas, which in my view is the wrong way to think about hydrogen, but that's a little bit the narrative that developed, and that's, I would say, in policy circles, a narrative that was pushed on the ground in terms of actual investments. I don't think it's something reflected in reality. I think hydrogen is still progressing quite slowly in Europe, and we're not really seeing a huge ramp up of the sector. So that's a bit where the debate is stuck between these two endpoints of replacing Russian natural gas or doing things around the edges. And I think, going back to the remarks I made at the beginning on manufactured products, for me with hydrogen, that's another really big question for Europe. Two of the big things it's likely going to make a lot of sense to do with hydrogen is producing steel and producing fertilizers. And producing steel, to take that as one example, that's the foundation of the European Union, the coal and steel community. That's where we came from. And do we want to try and produce all of this clean hydrogen
Recording
in Europe
in progress.
to then make steel? Or do we accept that, for example, in Australia, where you can produce green hydrogen with lots of land very cheaply, it's quite hard to put that on a ship and send it to Europe as hydrogen. It's a lot easier to make steel rods, put them on a ship and send them to Europe, and economically that would make our decarbonization much easier. But again, then your steel is made in Australia, and how do you feel about that in Europe? So for me, that's again the question of hydrogen. And just to close, and I mentioned at the beginning of this ladder, there are those who think hydrogen can heat our homes and can drive our cars, and I think increasingly the consensus is that this doesn't make any sense, and I'm quite firmly of the belief that electrification is decarbonisation in Europe, and hydrogen will be a kind of a niche complement to that. So we can discuss, energy security of it, but I don't think it will be at all comparable in relevance to gas today.
Well, no, I think it's helpful, and I think it's important to keep in mind the context in which plans are produced and sort of visions are articulated. And of course, all technologies sort of go through the cycle of sort of hype and then reality and then true progress. And I think that's probably what we'll see in hydrogen as well. It makes me happy to hear that there are European experts who are thinking like this. So, Europe's future. You've characterized Europe as energy poor. We've talked about the costs. Energy security seems to have improved through the function of diversity. At bare minimum, we've got increased diversity. So that's valuable. The long-term goal, the long-term vision seems to be electrification, large-scale electrification, and then figuring out a way to supply that electricity. So I guess on one side, I'm curious. In the U.S., we have this huge conversation around electric demand growth. And it looks like Andre's back. Perfect timing, Andre. Excellent work. We have a huge conversation around electric demand growth. Obviously, Europe has spent 2 years shedding demand. Some of that might be sort of, I guess you might characterize as good demand response, effective pricing signals, introducing market mechanisms by which consumers can sort of respond to prices. We like that. That's a good demand response. That creates a more efficient system. But of course, as you mentioned, there's been some bad demand response. It might be better characterized as demand destruction. Long term, however, I guess I'll ask Andre this question. How does Europe think about the scale of demand growth electric demand growth in particular, that it might see over the not next year or the year following, but the 5, the 10, the 20-year strategic perspective on electric demand growth? And I think we'll all want to talk about, okay, how do we serve electricity? Because that seems to be the fundamental question for Europe 20 years from now. How do we deliver this at volume? So Andre, just to start at least, is Europe thinking about electric demand growth the way we're kind of worked up about this in the U.S.?
Thank you very much. Great to be back. Case in point, infrastructure. We need infrastructure. Telecommunication, energy, we need it. So, no, I agree. And I think looking at all the scenarios that we are considering at the moment, electrification will grow and has to grow in order to stay within the limits of 1.5 climate targets for 2050. And we are seeing that, of course, we are seeing what Ben was mentioning, some demand decreasing in industrial sectors, and that is not good, obviously. We are seeing some demand that just responded to the price signals and invested in some capacity in improving and making its demand more efficient, its consumption more efficient. But I think looking forward, we have no choice, basically, but to follow and to focus on electricity when it comes to mobility, when it comes to heating, when it comes to other energy consumptions. And I think electrification, to Ben's point, is actually one of the reasons why hydrogen may not be a solution to everything, because Europe has, even with this demand the decrease over the past few years, Europe still has, at least in some regions, a electricity deficit. We are trying to, and we are pushing for electrification across our different, let's say, demand energy options. And for these reasons, probably hydrogen will not be a solution in that sense. We are seeing that. We are seeing demand in the coming years picking up. I know in the US there's a lot of demand increase explained by the fact that data centers are picking up once again. I think we will see that, and we continue to see that in Europe. So we have all the vectors, all the ingredients that indicate an increase in electrification demand. The question is how, once again, going back to my previous point, how to serve them, through the current and existing infrastructure, and what we put in place in order to make up to offset the supply that we are trying to decarbonize in the next few years.
So, Emily, I'll go to you now. Thinking about long-term strategic perspective, where is Europe going to get its electricity from? I mean, and I'd ask the same question to Ben. Renewables seem to be the path. Gas is going to serve as a balancing resource. We're going to need to build transmission. Is that division, and therefore it's just fundamentally a question of deployment? Is the ability to finance and permit and solve the political battles associated with sort of that vision, the fundamental energy security risk facing Europe?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's part of it. I think we've talked about it earlier today. Yes, renewables is the way forward in Europe. I mean, that's already, Europe is producing a lot more of its electricity via renewable energy, and that's going to be the path forward, with obviously gas as a bridge fuel for quite some time. I think the question remains, how is Europe going to do that in a competitive way, right? Is it going to be a leader in producing the technology for clean energy? Is it going to remain competitive in doing that? And so right now, the question is, how can Europe compete vis-a-vis the US and the IRA and China? And so I think that's a challenge for industrial policy, and that's really sort of the question on everybody's mind this day for Europe. Is Europe needs a serious industrial policy that's going to have some major structural adjustments that I think are going to be quite painful in a lot of places. We're already sort of seeing those structural adjustments, and Ben was mentioning earlier, I mean, there's a manufacturing problem in Europe, and we were talking a little bit before this panel. If you look at historically at when you start to lose competitiveness in manufacturing, you lose jobs. They go to places where it's cheaper to manufacture. Those don't come back. Those jobs, they don't return generally. So it's a kind of imperative right now to make the sort of adjustments to stop those jobs from leaving, and to replace maybe some of the heavy industry that was powered by cheap Russian gas for the last 40, 50 years, with now changing those jobs to clean energy manufacturing. But that's a challenge, because the IRA has some serious distortional effects. The EU knew about this immediately, but is trying to sort of compete for this challenge now. But then also China, and then that gets you back to the circular logic of the question: now are we sort of replacing this dependency now on China for critical mineral production and refining, right? And this is something that the EU and the US are working very hard at right now, is trying to understand the actual national security implications of dependency on China and other places for critical minerals. And this is not a question that's actually been very well studied. I have a Minerva grant right now that I'm working on this very issue with, and we just ran the second of our series of events last week at UT Austin, and we had a whole bunch of folks from DoD and DOE and state and then private sector actors, and there is still no consensus actually around what are the actual risks of critical mineral supply chains. We don't know, right? We know the extent to which China has a portion of the manufacturing, of the production, of the refining chain, but what does that actually mean in terms of our resilience and resistance if there was going to be, in some sense, a blockade? How else can we source these kind of places? Okay, do we want to go to Indonesia? Well, what do their laws against export bans and their Chinese involvement mean? There's just so many layers of these questions that we really haven't figured it out yet. So I think understanding actually what the implications of that risk are, and then figuring out the extent to which we can or will cooperate with China is a huge question.
This is going to be an unplanned question, so I'm going to throw this to Andre or Ben. We haven't talked about, another tool in the toolkit, which is nuclear. I think there's always been sort of divergent visions of nuclear in Europe. I don't think that's going away anytime soon. But I think there's a lot of excitement about the opportunities associated with SMRs. You're seeing certain countries, let's say Poland, really pursue this aggressively. France, of course, an incumbent and sort of a leader in this field. Is nuclear a way out of this sort of tension? And what is the role of, I guess I'd say, sort of European policy in terms of facilitating this, or is this going to be and remain sort of a national level issue? I'll throw this to you, or Andre. I'd love to get your thoughts on the arc of nuclear in Europe.
Maybe I go
I'm a
quick.
nuclear engineer first, so I'll pass this to Ben maybe. I'm a bit biased on that, so I'll pass this to Ben.
Okay. Well, no, I want to hear your point, but Ben, please go first, and then we'll hear from the engineer.
I don't plan to say anything on nuclear specifics. I leave that for Andre. it will remain a national policy issue. It's not possible to get European unanimity on nuclear, and it's a kind of permissible environment, but that's something that's hard. So I think this will remain a national issue where some countries will pursue this aggressively, like France, and others won't. And I mean, it's a slightly different, but our question in Europe at the moment is, and I think it will come more with the election, is there's this growing sense of we're 8-9% of global emissions. We've done a lot to decarbonize. Why should we keep doing it? Why should we introduce a carbon tax? And one of the things I think is fascinating about Europe, and Europe can kind of provide to the world, is this laboratory of different decarbonization pathways, where you will have France, who will try and get a grid that's 90% nuclear ran, where you will get Germany, who will have no nuclear in the grid, and they'll try and do kind of hydrogen or natural gas, CCS, back up to renewables, where you'll have the countries around the Alps who will have hydro storage backing this up, and all this kind of amalgamation of very different electricity mixes, obviously with transmission capacity. But that's one thing where I think it's quite exciting for Europe. And whatever you think about nuclear, I think it's quite exciting that at least a few countries in Europe pursue this pathway, and we don't only decarbonize in the solar wind battery, but we have this different thing, which then provides to countries around the world who, for whatever reason, don't deploy solar or wind at the same level, a second option of nuclear, a third option of hydro if they happen to have the resources available. And so for me, that's something exciting about Europe, and kind of a service Europe could do for the world in showing these different electricity decarbonization pathways.
Yeah. Sort of security in diversity once again shows up there. Andre, please. Sorry, I'm pointing, but.
I don't want to be a story topper, but I agree with Ben, basically. We have very different starting points, and I think the nuclear industry speaks volumes to how different member states are across the EU. But I think what is different when it comes to the nuclear sector, when it comes to nuclear generation, what is very different is that there's the prerequisite to deploy something is a sort of an experience in that field. It's not something that you can acquire just by buying it. It's something that you need to basically foster either domestically or with your partners. So that translates into higher lead times, I would say, for those that haven't started or that don't have a nuclear plan. But I think Ben's point is correct, and it shows the diversity across the EU, and it shows the challenges, and it shows how solutions coming from Brussels are not universal, are not silver bullets, and can only provide some sort of benefits to some countries and no benefits to others. So I think that's, the diversity of that is actually both a pain point to some extent, as well as an advantage that the member states have.
Okay, so I'm going to open up the questions. If people want to talk about electricity, gas markets in Europe, this is your chance. I'll start with Samer, please. Sure. Samer.
Thank you. Great panel. Love the discussion. Ben, I'm really curious. Bruegel's like right in the mix. You guys are there, like in the weeds, and you're talking to a lot of people. And this is a question I was hoping nobody asked me, but I'm gonna ask you. Russian gas, it's there, right? And there's a lot of industry who are near it, is there talk still amongst industry in the region about a scenario in which you turn the taps back on? I mean, again, the pipes are there, right? So I'm curious, what is the energy? What are the vibes? What are the vibes over there?
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you for the difficult question, and we'll make sure all the panelists can get in on this if they dare to.
I work for a think tank, so the beauty is I can say what I want, and it doesn't matter. So no, and I mean, this morning the conversation was that there's no going back. I don't think Europe's about to turn back, and this isn't based on conversations with industry, but my sense would be a little bit more pessimistic, I guess is the right word, that it might be possible. Europe hasn't introduced any sanctions on natural gas, which people forget, and policymakers, they say we successfully transitioned away from Russian natural gas. Well, we haven't yet, it's still there, and we didn't. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline was blown up, and Russia demanded payments in rubles. That's largely what happened and why we don't have as much Russian natural gas in Europe. So there's no sanctions, and something we've been calling for is that, we should introduce sanctions. There should be kind of a maximum amount of Russian natural gas, and there should be a European mechanism which says, if we want to keep importing this gas, it goes through this body at the European level, which says this is the maximum you can have per year. And there's not any political appetite for doing this. So it's not based on, I mean, you're asking if I've heard from industry. I haven't heard from industry, but I would share the same opinion that the pipelines are all still there. The gas is really cheap. Russia can't send that gas anywhere else for now, and the Power of Siberia 2, which should connect those fields to the... It's not happening. And you would think, I mean, you'd think with a crisis they would have kind of expedited construction. Exactly. So all the gas is there. It's not. So no, I see the same risk, and my sense would be that's a problem for signing long-term contracts for LNG, whether that be with the US or Qatar, is until you have kind of a legally binding political thing that says, here we sign, we will never import in the future more than X BCM of Russian gas. It will always be there. And in a scenario of political change, I don't see why it wouldn't play a role. So.
I'll also jump in to say that there is still Russian gas still flowing into Europe today. I was just looking at something which showed that I think Italy is importing 3 times more Russian gas today than it was in 2021 or 2022, something like some figure like that. So it's still happening. I should also always preface my remarks that my remarks do not represent that of the Department of Defense or NATO. This is me speaking in my personal capacity as an academic. I spent many years living in Europe doing interviews with, particularly in Berlin, with industrial consumers and their relationship with Gazprom. And I spoke recently with some of these industrial producers in Germany in particular, and they said that nothing was ever off the table. Now, of course, these were the industries that were most closely associated with Gazprom at the height. I mean, they would, have lunch with Gazprom in Berlin, 3 times a week. But yeah, I think that when the rubber meets the road, these companies care about cost, and they care about remaining competitive. And today's current energy environment means that they are no longer competitive. And so that if there is still a permissive environment that allows them to buy Russian gas in a way that's not completely politically toxic for them, I think that they will do that.
Andre?
So also in my personal capacity, let's say, I think, yeah, Russian gas is still flowing. So there's still some gas flowing through Ukraine, right? That will end at the end of this year, basically the Gazprom contract. At least this is what we know at the moment. And LNG is still, Russian LNG gas is still flowing to Europe. As far as I remember, the numbers, 15% of it, of the LNG import in Spain is Russian, 13% in France or something like that. So there's still Russian gas flowing to Europe. And it may be one of the next moves on the chessboard from Kremlin. So yeah, we need to take a look on what's happening next, before understanding whether or not, new contracts or new gas will come back to Europe from Russia.
Yeah, and I think, Ben, your suggestion of, there are policy models perhaps to manage this in the future, should that future arise. I'm going to open the floor to any final questions here.
Yeah, almost all the discussion today has focused on gas and electricity, with even one reference to LNG being seen as something of a legacy fuel. Well, what about a dinosaur fuel? I mean, the war in Ukraine has also disrupted markets for petroleum products, most particularly heavy distillates. Does anybody have anything to say about that?
Not in depth. I mean, during the crisis, we looked at gas and crude markets and the threats. I mean, that's crude, so not even distillates, but the threat from Russian disruption. And I mean, before the embargo on Russian oil, which is an area where the EU did take action itself, there was a big fear in Europe, not comparable to natural gas, but not like orders of magnitude lower than natural gas. It was felt that oil was almost as difficult to get off as natural gas. And okay, again, for crude, distillates maybe was a little bit harder, but for crude, it wasn't that hard. With the ship trade, Europe itself was able to get off Russian crude oil very quickly. So I think the sense in Europe was probably that for oil markets, with the existence of things like the IEA, that Europe was well prepared and was well able to diversify from Russian supplies. But on distillates particularly, I can't really comment.
Wait, we got a question.
Thank you. Bob Eichord from the Atlantic Council. There's been more discussion in the U.S. these days about the implications of CBAM and what it means for the U.S. Industry and trade. And I don't know too much about it, although it's going to go into effect in early 26. What does it mean in terms of imports of energy, domestic industry, operations, prices, competitiveness, et cetera?
Yeah, Ben, Andre, Emily, anyone who would like to comment on CBAM?
I can take it. So the context is the European emissions trading system, which puts a carbon price on heavy industry. And for about 15 years, we've had free allowances. So essentially your steel plants, your ammonia plants, we gave them a carbon tax, but we said, here's all the permits for free and you can trade them. So we kind of created a market, but it was a bit of a false one. And about 2 or 3 years ago, this was the introduction of CBAM, was to try and get rid of those free allowances so that they would face the real incidence of a carbon price. That's the birth of CBAM. And I think that's important to understand because especially the technocrats in Brussels really didn't intend this at all as a tariff barrier or as some kind of opposition. And there's some in the Commission like Thierry Breton and others who kind of talk about we're going to use all these money and raise all our own funds, et cetera, which I think is very damaging to the position. And Europe hasn't done a great job on communicating that we want to put a carbon price on our heavy industry, but we can't do that unless we have some kind of protection at the border. Otherwise, they'll just all move away. So that's the context. And what it means, well, I think it's, in my sense, a bit narrower than people typically interpret it. I mean, it's very specific energy and trade intensive commodities, things like steel, things like aluminium, things like ammonia, where, I mean, the production in countries who don't have a comparable carbon tax or comparable something else, which creates huge complications with the states, how you some of the permits and these sort of things or the regulations here, how do you translate that into a carbon price? So I don't think we're very far along. I think there's still a big challenge there. But for the states, my sense is it shouldn't have, assuming the states maintains kind of a similar trajectory in decarbonisation, I wouldn't have a sense it will have a huge impact. And it's more places like Indonesia or Morocco with coal-fired steel where that's really targeted at having an impact.
Okay, so that's it for us. Thank you all for this wonderful discussion, and we're going to have we're going to have another panel in a moment, and then one more at the end of the day on supply chains. Please join me in giving my panelists a round of applause.
And now we're going to talk more geopolitics than energy and climate. This is sort of the guns and bombs parts of the conversation today. With me on the panel, I have an excellent panel. To my far left is Ian Lesser, who's Vice President of GMF of the Global German Marshall Fund South and Executive Director of the Brussels office. Ian is the vice president there. He's also served as the executive director of the Brussels office and leads the organization's work on transatlantic relations and the Mediterranean and Turkey. And his expertise includes U.S. foreign policy and European and Middle Eastern security affairs. Joining above me is Charlie Kupchin, virtually. Charlie is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and a professor of international affairs at Georgetown University. He was from 2014 to 2017. He served as special assistant to the president and senior director for European affairs on the National Security Council in the Obama White House. And prior to that, his career has spanned the Clinton administration, National Security Council, the policy planning staff, where I once served as well at the State Department and at Princeton University. And then we're also pleased to have Anna Bukolska, research staff member, Science and Technology Policy Institute and the Institute for Defense Analyses. Prior to that, she was a senior fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute, where she co-led the program on energy and geopolitics in Eurasia, and a senior fellow at the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy at the University of Pennsylvania. And I forgot to introduce myself. I am Max Bergman. I'm the director of the Eurasia Program. And I think this whole conversation that we're having today is, I think, really about the fusion of the energy and climate issues with the harder national security defense topics that we oftentimes engage in. I was in Ukraine a few weeks ago, and one of the most depressing aspects was actually going to the energy ministry. And it's not simply that the Ukrainian grid is being destroyed, but it really hit me that probably one of the most foremost experts now on Russian missiles and drones and the impacts that they have is the energy ministry, that has seen Russian tactics, techniques, and procedures evolve in how they are striking Ukraine's energy grid. This war that's now spanned after over 2 years has also seen the explosion of pipelines in Europe, and has really remade Europe's energy orientation in some ways back to the United States or toward the United States, but also to other regions. And so I think there's a lot here to discuss. But Ian, maybe I'll start with you. You are a keen watcher on all things Europe with your perch at GMF at Brussels. So in the 2 years since the war, have you seen a real sort of paradigm shift with how Europe views energy issues, energy security, and how it views essentially Russian energy, to pick up on a topic that we touched on at the last panel?
Max, thank you very much, and thanks very much for the invitation to be here. It's a fascinating discussion. Just a couple of points maybe about this. One is that, as an American sitting in Brussels, this is very much something I follow. This is really a time of anxiety on all of these fronts in Europe. I mean, it's absolutely palpable in Brussels. And there is an interaction, as you say, between the geopolitical anxiety, the economic anxiety, the energy supply anxiety, the competitiveness anxiety. I mean, and you've heard that in various ways, I think, from different speakers already. But they do interact with it. And I would add even to that another anxiety, which is an anxiety about us, if I can say, about the United States and what's happening here. I think, just a couple of points. One is, I think what you're seeing now really underscores the aspiration, on the one hand, for strategic autonomy in different fronts, including in the energy sphere in Europe, and the gap between that aspiration and what is actually possible, at least in the near term, and the expense and the time that it would take to actually get where Europe aspires to be, especially on defense, but also in many other sectors. There's a huge gap there. And you see it underscored in different ways, and we've already talked about some of that. The second point I'd make about that is that there are some there's an understanding that that there are structural shifts, there are structural investments or structural preferences that Europe had historically with regard to energy. And the head of the International Energy Agency the other day commented on this, that the long-term choices that Europe had made, whether by design or simply by practice, of reliance on Russian LNG on the one hand and distaste for nuclear in many places on the other, has not served Europe well. But to reverse those structural choices is not easy and not quick. And so I think there is some anxiety about this. Also, I think the green transition is now under stress. It's in many ways been overtaken by a debate about competitiveness. And surely these things are not irreconcilable, but they're not easily reconcilable. Something that I would also mention, and it's been mentioned by a number of your speakers, is that there has been a response to this supply insecurity with regard to Russia that has reinforced north-south connections. Now, that's taken many different forms in terms of connectivity. Whether you actually get to a point where places like North Africa but also in Southern Europe are able to sort of fill this renewables, to export renewable energy. I mean, it's been an aspiration for many, many years. Whether this actually creates the sort of circumstances where it's possible, we'll see. The final, maybe a final point, if I have a moment. Please. And that I think there is now people are now discussing things that would have been unthinkable a short while ago. I mean, when Joseph Borrell talks about the possibility of a general war in Europe, this is extraordinary. And it doesn't need to be by design. I think there's a growing sense that as there's this open-ended quality, this impasse in Ukraine, that the accumulated risk of something simply going wrong that leads Europe, NATO, into an escalation that wasn't necessarily intended, but nonetheless leads you somewhere, it's a very real thing. And of course, if we think about sort of the kinetic risks to energy infrastructure and other things, under those conditions, you have a very different, very different situation. So, and that could happen quite quickly. So you get, on the one hand, this thinking about something at much greater scale, in terms of a problem, and at speed that no one wished to contemplate. I can say more about the American piece of it and some other things, but we can come back to it.
Let me just follow up quickly, because one of the I think hallmarks of the Biden administration and also with the European Commission has been the Trade and Technology Council. We actually haven't heard much about it today, because I think the deliverables, the tangible deliverables that have come out of it have not been maybe as ambitious as what was expected or hoped for. But do we have the right level of ambition? You mentioned Europe pursuing its own quote-unquote strategic autonomy on the energy side. But it does strike me that we are, in some ways, have a lot to cooperate over here, over the energy space, that Europe's turning to U.S. LNG is one aspect of that. But has the IRA created opportunities for cooperation, or has it just created barriers and annoyance? Should we increase our level of ambition there between U.S. and EU?
I think, Europeans are keenly aware of the extent to which they are now reliant, not necessarily in a negative way, but anyway, on U.S. energy exports. By the way, that's a return to a historic reality. I mean, until, the late 1940s, that was the U.S. role, was the leading energy supplier to Europe. And so it's not a new thing for Europe to experience that. I think in a bigger sense, whether you're talking about energy technologies or many other things, I would be concerned about this growing tension between economic nationalism, in many places actually, on the one hand, and the desire, the need even for greater alliance cohesion in the face of what we're confronting with Russia, but also with China in a different way. You see this, we're talking about Europe here, but you can see this with Japan too, with the United States. That, how do you reconcile those things? And I think it's one of the reasons why the TTC hasn't functioned very well. The private sector is an enormous stakeholder in this, because so many of the regulatory battles over whether you're talking about data privacy or environmental regulations or many other things are being made in Brussels. Being made in Brussels. And if we had TTIP, maybe we would have a different kind of discourse about all of this, but we don't.
We can't talk about TTIP.
Don't
talk about TTIP.
No,
that's the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership that died during the Obama administration, and everyone is afraid to bring it back up. But Anna, I want to bring you in. You're an expert on energy security and the geopolitics of energy security. How has the war impacted Europe overall? European interaction, not just with the United States, but other regions of the world, has increased, maybe with the Gulf states in particular. Have you seen shifts, or am I kind of stretching some of what may happen? How would you assess how Europe has evolved from an energy security perspective in the last couple of years?
I think at first, we should probably underscore that Europe is not as uniform as we might often think when we say in Europe, right? There's the UK versus EU, but there's also the Western versus Eastern Europe, or the post-Soviet Europe, which, in my view, has seen energy security, in particular, from the perspective of dependence on Russia, very differently than the West. And that has been a historical perspective, right? The West has depended on Russian gas over the Cold War, and nothing happened. Germany was happily receiving gas since 1970s, despite nuclear threats, right? So, whereas countries in Central Eastern Europe have had experiences of gas not flowing after 1990s, when they stopped being under direct influence, and that influence had to be replaced by other type of influences, and that was in some cases push for, basically using gas as geopolitical weapons, sometimes oil as well, but gas has been the easiest one because it was so regionally focused. That changed with LNG, of course, and Central Eastern Europe has been talking about the issue of being dependent on Russian gas. And has been, but to some extent it has been this kind of, the boy who cries wolf. Because we've heard from Poland all the time and from Lithuania or Latvia, don't depend on Russian gas, something's going to happen, and nothing was happening, right? So that kind of kept being discounted as the years progressed until it kind of came through in the second invasion. I think the first invasion on Ukraine should have been a wake-up call. It hasn't been, unfortunately. The second invasion, something had to change. And I think that was the awakening that in the Western Europe, that energy security matters. Still, that's not kind of the thing of the past, that at some points you will have to use every type of energy, even if you don't want to admit it, that you might have to disassemble a wind farm to put a lignite mine, like Germany did. Whether or not you're going to be using it, that will be up to the future. However, I think what was happening in reality was accompanied by a different type of message. The message was, yes, we have to do what we have to do. This is expediency. We need to go and create better future in terms of cleaner energy and so on. And I think these goals are there. Now, how they can be reconciled, it will depend on whether Europe is able to create this energy security scenario where it's not only the accessibility and of energy but also affordability of it. And that's what the previous panel was talking about. Can Europe be competitive? Can Europe be the leader? To some extent, can Europe bring in the clean energy future somewhere else? Or what it will do, it will just discount the oil and gas for other countries by using more expensive energy itself.
Charlie, I want to bring you in. You've been tracking the events in Ukraine very closely, the events in Moscow. This strikes me as a clear case where Russia, at least prior to the actual invasion and then in the aftermath of the initial invasion, began to throttle its gas flows into Europe. And while it's sort of unclear what happened with the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines, that energy was being used as a geopolitical lever, as a foreign policy tool for Russia. How do you think that has fared, and how do you think the Kremlin sort of views energy as a lever now, as it sort of looks back on the crisis, and what impact has that had on European thinking when it comes to their own energy and national security? Charlie, you're muted.
Thanks, Max. Wish I could be there in person, but we'll do the best we can with remote. I think that the Russians overestimated their ability to weaponize energy and underestimated, number one, the nature and scope of the European response, and number two, the unity that has endured since February 2022 within Europe and across the Atlantic. And I think it's understandable why they overestimated the utility of that weapon. And the answer is, Anna began to talk about it, which is until February 2022, it really didn't look like the Europeans took seriously the strategic vulnerabilities emerging from energy dependence on Russia. And so the Russians saw what I think we could call complacency on that front. And there was no complacency. I think one of the more striking features of the response that we saw emerge after the Russian invasion in February of 2022 was just how far and how quickly Europe has gone to wean itself off of Russian energy. Yes, there is still some Russian fossil fuel flowing into EU countries, but there really has been just a fundamental transformation in where Europe gets its energy in a way that has dried up the dependence that we saw before. And I think on all three lines of effort, not just the sanctions, but aiding Ukraine economically and militarily and bolstering NATO's eastern flank, I am still struck by how much unity and solidarity there has been within Europe and across the Atlantic. Yeah, there have been some bumps. Yes, it took a long time for our Congress to approve the recent aid package, but the bigger picture is one of striking unity and solidarity. That's the good news. The bad news is that when you ask how effective has Europe's reorientation of its energy supplies and the broader sanctions, and let's be frank here, this was the nuclear option. We threw the book at Russia. We went much further in terms of sanctions than I think the Biden administration intended, but it hasn't really worked. And the Russian economy is doing okay, mainly because Russia has simply moved its supply chains. It's selling energy to the Chinese, to the Indians, to others. Instead of getting imports from Western Europe, they're flowing in from Turkey and Georgia and Central Asia. And so the idea that somehow we were going to strangle Russia economically, that didn't work. And I think we can draw some important lessons there about just how hard it is to sanction big countries in a globalized world. And that may require us to think hard and long about our policies toward China and the efficacy in general of this kind of economic isolation. A couple quick other points just to end. One is that I think the implications of our inability to really impose economic pain on Russia are, number one, that Russia has staying power, that Russia's population, its economy, its defense industrial base are performing at a level that basically it requires us to say time is not on Ukraine's side. And I think we need to factor that in when we plot our strategy for where we go from here. And the other important implication, I think, is that to the degree that there is a real loser in the economic implications of the sanctions, it's the global South, where we have seen energy shortages, high energy prices, food shortages. And that in part explains why 2/3 of the world effectively has not taken sides and is not getting on board when it comes to isolating Russia. And that's an important conclusion, I think, to draw at a time when the US and China are attempting to get an upper hand in that part of the world. My final comment, I do think, Max, that despite the positive things that I've said about transatlantic unity and the effectiveness of sanctions and the end of energy dependence, I don't think we've spent enough time talking about the long-term effects of those measures on us. And if you were to say, what do I most worry about moving forward? It's not Vladimir Putin, it's us. It is the impact of high energy prices, of German companies shutting down, of millions of Ukrainian refugees, on political moderation and ideological centrism in our own societies. Had we been on this call a couple years ago, I would have said, thank goodness the center is holding in continental Europe. I wouldn't make that kind of statement today. I don't like the political trends that I see in France and Germany. And I do think we need to have a more forthright conversation about how our policies toward Russia, toward the Ukraine war in general, even if working in the sense of helping Ukraine defend itself, may be undermining political centrism at home.
Let me follow up, because there's one area where we haven't really gone after, and that's really the energy sector, the Russian energy sector. As was mentioned, that there aren't actually sanctions against the Russian gas sector. It's just European countries have turned away from purchasing, and pipelines were exploded. But the oil and gas, or oil, we have tried to put, essentially create a mechanism with the Russian oil price cap to try to keep Russian oil on the market, to keep global prices, oil prices low, but to deprive Russia of revenue. The administration sort of defends the efficacy of this measure. I think many other experts would say, well, it hasn't really impacted how much revenue is going to the Kremlin. Do you think, your last comments, the skepticism of sanctions, I take that on board, but looking at the Russian energy sector, is that something that, do you think we'll see oil sanctions post an election if Biden were reelected? Is that an area where, if you were in the White House, where you've just won a reelection, and this is assuming a Biden victory, is Russian oil on something that should be looked at, or is that too hard a lever to pull for the United States and in the West, given concerns about political moderation?
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to defer to Anna and to Ian. I think they have more expertise on detailed energy issues than I do, but I would respond in the following way, Max, and it's a very interesting question. I think that the price, the cap has to some extent worked, to some extent not. The real problem is that there are too many buyers of relatively cheap Russian energy to in any way really put a serious clamp on sales and therefore income to the Russians. And I'll be, just very instrumental in my reply here. If you're in the White House and you're running for re-election, and you know that the American electorate is probably most concerned moving forward about prices, about the cost of living, and you know that perhaps the election could turn on the price of gas at the pump, I think you're going to tread very carefully, even after the election. And I do think that, yes, inflation has slowed down. But, I don't know about you, Max, but, when I go trundling off to Trader Joe's or Safeway to fill my fridge, it's still bloody expensive for bread, for milk, for eggs. At my local gas station, it was down in like $3.20 a few months ago. It's now close to $4. If you're a politician, you are keeping a very, very close eye on that sign on Connecticut Avenue about how much a gallon of gas costs.
Okay, thanks. And maybe back over to you on that question.
Sure. So I think sanctions work if everybody is on board. If we have, as Charlie mentioned here, if we have other buyers willing to buy that because for cheaper price, then the sanctions have an issue, of course. Now, Russia has also developed a considerable shadow fleet where sanctions kind of don't necessarily apply, and that fleet also is traveling around the world and bringing in Russian oil and products. Now, some of that fleet has been purchased from European sellers, so there is also that, or other type of sellers. So I think sanctions are very difficult. I think to some extent they will work. It's just a very long term. And it's very difficult to assess how they work, because you have to basically compare it to counterfactual. What would have Russian energy industry be in 10 years had there been no war and no sanctions? Probably better off than it will be. But then again, there are political versus economic issues. And at least in my view, the Russian government, in particular Vladimir Putin, doesn't care as much about economy as much as he cares about the ideological bent of whatever he wants to achieve. And that's what drives him. some of the assessment I've heard about, what will Russian industry be because of sanctions as well. We're not going to be as efficient. We may be going to be at 70, 80%, but we'll still do fine because some of the technology we'll be bringing or any resources are going to be from China. The question also is, are we willing to have Russia be a vassal state to China, considering how we consider China a competitor to the West in general? So that's also something that we have to kind of think about as we look through what type of effect the sanctions have and how we imagine our world, particularly at the time where cooperation, even within West, is not as easy as we would like it to be.
Maybe over to you. I mean, my understanding is the oil price cap kind of came out of the administration being shocked that Europe was forging ahead on sanctions on the Russian oil industry, and that caused heart palpitations here in Washington, and then hence the oil price cap mechanism being sort of a compromise solution that was then negotiated throughout 2022. But how do you see this, going forward?
I think you have to ask a fundamental question, and I think in different ways we've all hinted at this. What do we want these sanctions to do? And I mean, in the most basic sense, we wanted somehow to change Russian policy. On that basis, at least so far, it's failed. Now, you could argue that you could get to some threshold moment, both in terms of both operationally on the ground and in terms of perhaps economic costs, where this would flip and you would see. But, I'm not so sure. I mean, I would agree very much with what you said, Anna, that, that the whatever his sort of ideological, strategic objectives about Ukraine just simply trump his concern about sanctions in this sector. But that's not the only thing sanctions do. I mean, sanctions can be a vehicle for cohesion among allies. They can make you feel better. I'm no joke. I mean, there are people who've done long studies about the effectiveness of sanctions, and there's a reason why they work best with your friends. So I think I'm a little skeptical about that. The leakage point, I think, is very important that you mentioned. Another very interesting thing in terms of transatlantic relations on sanctions is, I think it's quite striking the extent to which the Biden administration has had the European Union as the interlocutor on sanctions, on export controls. That's not necessarily an instinct that would have been shared by, many previous administrations of either party, actually. And that's really noticed in Europe. Because, in fact, you're dealing in terms of energy, and also a lot of other politically existential issues in Europe, including defense and borders, that actually aren't EU competencies. Yeah. It's optional. But we've chosen to view the EU as an interlocutor in this, and it's been quite effective, not in terms of necessarily the effect of the sanctions, but in terms of transatlantic cohesion around the policy, it's been quite effective.
I'm going to transition to another subject, but before I do, I have to make a quick plug. Today, we actually came out with a new report at CSIS on looking at the impact of sanctions on Russia's defense industry. We did one last year. It was called Out of Stock. This year, it's called Back in Stock. And essentially, Russia has found a way around sanctions, but really it's been a huge increase in dual-use components that are being exported by China. The one thing, however, not to remove my moderator hat for a second, I think the sanctions defenders would say, and I think I would agree with this, is that they do disrupt. And so when we talk about supply chain resilience and supply chains being really important, well, when you're trying to build, when you have factories that are humming and you're trying to do 2 and 3 shifts, run 24 hours a day, and that machine tool breaks, and then you need to figure out how to get it. And instead of being able to just go to the German supplier, which you used to be able to do, you now have to smuggle it. Well, you can get it, but it may take time and cause a degree of disruption, which, any little bit of friction may in some ways have some benefit. But let me shift gears, because one of the topics that I think came up earlier in some of our discussions, I think is quite relevant, and that is the energy infrastructure that Europe has as not just being critical, as we oftentimes describe it, but as also a potential target. And we have seen Russian espionage efforts and active measures, from assassination campaigns through targeting Czech ammunition depot, and after Russia's invasion of 2014. And also critical infrastructure things happening over the last few years. And it worries me that we don't seem to now have a clear ability to deter these actions, because we have sanctioned Russia endlessly. We have put a diplomatic isolation against Russia. There's very few tools that we have short of kind of military kinetic threats now to, I think, deter some of the more concerning kinetic actions. I'm curious how you see this challenge, this threat. Maybe, Charlie, maybe I'll start with you and then go backwards to the panelists.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting question, Max, in the sense that we do seem now to be heading into an era in which both kinetic warfare and hybrid warfare does entail these kinds of efforts to disrupt critical infrastructure. I mean, if you look at what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, particularly in the absence of American air defense systems, you know, they're pounding infrastructure. They're trying to disrupt the energy flow, the water flow, and they're being reasonably successful in ways that will take a significant toll on Ukraine's ability to resist. And to some extent, we've seen similar activities by Israel in Gaza, degrading core infrastructure. And so it does seem to be becoming more of a kind of standard go after target in kinetic warfare. And at the same time, it looks like it's also an increasingly attractive target in non-kinetic scenarios, where we have seen disruptions of energy infrastructure in Europe. And we're also hearing about Chinese and or Russian and or Iranian efforts to implant malware in U.S. critical infrastructure, whether it's the pipeline. I think we had one instance in which there was a disruption in pipelines, but it could be in the energy grid. And maybe we're doing the same thing. Maybe we're planting malware in Iran, in Russia, I don't know. But I do think that this is in some ways, an understudied, underappreciated dimension that we ought to be paying more attention to.
Anna, curious for your thoughts. Being from Poland, there's been lots of activities that the Poles themselves are reporting on of Russian activity against infrastructure throughout Poland, but also but the energy infrastructure being a particular concern.
Right. No, absolutely, and it's not new. The energy infrastructure has been earlier in more nuanced way affected by Russia. At some point, I think the oil, for example, that Russia was flowing to Europe, it was flowing at the quality that Polish refineries couldn't refine it, but the Germans could, right? So there's different ways in which things can be affected, including infrastructures like refineries, and today we see the attacks on generators, gas pipelines, although not the trunk pipeline that flows Russian gas still to Europe, Austria or Slovakia.
Through Ukraine. Maybe.
Through Ukraine, absolutely. That has not been bombed, although the others one that would have flown gas to the local population, or the storage recently has been attacked. But what it predominantly should give us should make us think of is, well, what can we do to prevent these attacks? And one thing to do to prevent is to prepare for them, so they don't have the effect that that the attacker intends. So they don't prevent the flow of energy, and or at least not that can be, or at least that we can fix it really quickly. So how do we design our energy systems? One thing that I think of, what are we gonna do if we electrify everything? Are we gonna be more resilient, or are we going to be more exposed? If so, how can we make sure that by attacking our grid, we are not turning off everything that we basically use to live? So heat, water, and so on, and our cars, and so on and so on. So I think, there's little that we can do right now, probably immediately, but thinking about designing our energy future, that's extremely important.
Well, it just puts me in mind of the comment that was made in an earlier session about, being one click away from a very, very big problem as a result of this. Of course, I think it's also worth, thinking about the fact that these are very old strategies. Since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, people have been thinking of ways of economic warfare in this respect. And if there's a lesson from all of that, it seems to me, is that given enough time and enough focus, you can fix almost anything.
Enough money too.
And if you're willing to devote the resources and shift the economy around in such a way that you're going to fix it. And there's a lot of capacity for adaptation. It's arguably grown. Maybe even exponentially in recent years as the sort of intellectual inputs and the technological inputs, as opposed to the resource inputs, have become much more important. So I wouldn't, sort of overestimate our vulnerability. But clearly it's something worth watching, not least because, I think we see with Putin in various respects, whether we're talking about the kinetic piece of this or other things, just factoring this element of ruthlessness, which even during the Cold War, frankly, we never really had a kind of, element in the nuclear balance called ruthlessness. Mm-hmm. If anything, we had the opposite, which was a degree of caution. And that we don't see now. And then it could get much more complex because of the use of proxies who carry out these kinds of attacks. In some ways, what we're seeing in the Red Sea may be more instructive for what we're talking about than the consequences of what's happening between Russia, or as consequential as in terms of lessons.
Charlie, it seems like part of what we're talking about is building a degree of resilience and treating the energy sector, or potentially treating the energy sector more as kind of, as not just a national security priority. I think we would all agree that it's a national security priority, but part of what the militaries do is do a ton of planning about what events could go wrong, and they stockpile weapons, hopefully never to use those weapons. They're essentially, hopefully a stranded asset. But do we need to maybe think a little bit more about the energy sector in similar ways to try to boost our resilience? Having transformers, having generators, having other equipment that perhaps solar panels that could be brought for hospitals to maintain energy infrastructure. Does this need to be part of our kind of deterrence strategy effectively, so that no adversary will even bother trying to hit our energy infrastructure because it would make no point, there would be no point to doing so? Is that something that we need to start doing, or am I kind of overhyping some of the threats or concerns? You're muted, Charlie.
No, I don't think you're overhyping, Max. I think that given what we're witnessing taking place in Ukraine, in Europe, we do need to build in redundancy. We need to have, pipelines that may not be essential because the existing one is adequate, but you put in a second one just in case something happens. So I do think that prudence does require moving in this direction. And I thought Anna asked a good question. If we electrify, if all of our transportation is based upon batteries and charging, what are the implications for that? Does that make it easier or harder to disrupt? But I don't think that it's just a question of building in redundancy and resilience. There are a whole host of issues that I also think we need to think long and hard about trying to forge a set of rules of the road. And here I'm not just talking about attacks on energy, I'm talking about cyber war, the different uses of cyber tools to disrupt civilian society. You know, there's this whole new realm out there where, you know, we don't even have our own guidance system. We don't have our own rules of the road. You know, we don't even have our own legislation. Congress has yet to pass a single piece of legislation on regulating the digital arena. And so I think that is another area where we have to develop our own set of guiding rules and norms and try to socialize them first with allies, but not just with allies, also with adversaries.
I think it's a great point. Well, I want to move to questions from the audience in a minute, but before I do so, everyone think about their questions. Anna, Ian, any comments on Charlie's point?
I mean, look, there are people in the room who know a lot more about this than I do, but I would have thought that the more diversification, the more distribution you have in terms of critical infrastructure, the better. That and if you get that with, for example, increasing reliance on renewables or distributed generation or whatever it might be, it just gives you much more resilience and redundancy, I would have thought, than having you know, less sophisticated grids that are centralized and all the rest of it. I mean, it also there's something to say here about the nuclear power industry too, and there are people who know a lot about that, and I don't.
Yeah. And maybe I'll just go to you on the threat. How serious do you think the threat is, essentially, to Europe's energy infrastructure from Russia presently? Is this something that should be concerned about, should not be concerned about, should be overly concerned about? How panicked or not should?
Well, there's a lot of things that Europe has to be concerned about. It, so panic is probably not the best idea. Otherwise, they would just, you know, really in trouble. But there has to be concern. We've seen explosions in the Baltic Sea. We've seen Baltic interconnector being disrupted by an anchor, and some of cables, underwater cables, that had also been cut. Now, we don't know what force has done that. There are different theories and different opinions on that, but doesn't matter who has done who has done these actions. These need to be considered, and having most of the gas that goes to, or all of the gas that goes from Russia to Germany being cut off. That's an issue that Germany was lucky to be able to deal with, based on its associations with other countries in Europe. So I think it has to be an important part of energy policy. Now, as it was mentioned, energy policy is not in the purview of EU. It actually depends on each and single country. And that's an issue, because every country in Europe has a different idea of how that energy security should look like. Germany doesn't like a nuclear power to be in. Poland is introducing nuclear power right on the border of Germany. France is building it up back of its nuclear power. So you know, Spain has a huge amount of LNG import terminals, but doesn't have a way of connecting it to the rest of Europe. So it's not able to bring it, and France is not seeing this you know, the same need for pipelines. So I think while the solidarity between different European countries has existed in the face of a threat, there is a need for more of it, so the threats like threats to energy infrastructure can be addressed.
Great. Well, let me see if there's any questions for the panelists. If not, I'll ask one more. Any questions for our panelists? Yes, please.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. From the things that the U.S. and Europe are doing now, would you keep them doing the same thing, or you would do something different?
Great question. Ian. Tough question.
No, it's
Simple
a great question.
direct
It's
question.
extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult to answer. I mean, I think, look, you have to make some long-term assumptions, and you have to hope that they're well-informed and correct, because we're talking about policies and investments and decisions that are not only very expensive, but very consequential over time and very difficult to reverse. And so you need to make some decent assumptions about the long-term relationship with Russia, also with China, we're not so much talking about that, and some other things, and across the Atlantic. Because if some of those big picture variables are changed, are different, the decisions that you would make on some of these questions that we're discussing would look very different. If you don't trust the US as a supplier, you're going to go in a different direction. If you think that you're going to wind up in a kinetic war between NATO and Russia, you're going to make some choices about resilience of your infrastructure that you might not make otherwise. Because you do, as we were saying before we started this session, have people in industry, but not just, in Germany, but not just, who are just waiting for this thing to get settled so they can go back to a nice Ostpolitik and some relatively secure, cheap energy from Russia, and away you go. We have elections coming up, which will influence some of this stuff too. So.
And Charlie, let me actually just pick up on the point Ian made to ask our panelists. Do you see a scenario or scenarios in which Europe turns back to purchasing the stranded Russian gas that is sitting there? And if so, what would have to happen? Because I think in the present state, I do not see a scenario in which that happened, or do not see that happening. But I could envision future scenarios in which a lot changes. But I'm curious how you see it.
Austria is still buying a lot of Russian gas, like 100% of its use at times, right? Slovakia the same. So as the previous panelist mentioned, Europe has not sanctioned Russian gas. Russia sanctioned its gas against some countries like Poland or Bulgaria, for example. But Europe hasn't. So that's one indication. If there is a need, there is a will, right? However, I think the situation has changed. So if at any given point there will be a situation where Russia is able to trade back with Europe, and it could be Russian gas potentially, or as some maybe hydrogen, blue hydrogen that Russia is encouraging its companies to produce, then the idea would be that this Russian gas cannot at any given point become a weapon. Right? So, and this was not the case. And I've written before that, how do you do this? Well, you have enough redundancy, you have enough suppliers. So at any given time, you can replace the gas that's coming from Russia with something else, electricity, gas, whatever else it is. So Russia doesn't have that card, right? So it cannot play that card anymore. And then it becomes the normal supplier that everybody else is. If that's the case, I mean, do we really want to have this completely unfunctional, huge country on the European border that potentially, as I've mentioned, is a vassal state to China? And I mean, probably it's an issue. It will require a huge amount of careful consideration. But yeah.
Great.
I would just add, Max, that
please.
I think if you look at the likely outcomes in Ukraine, most of them involve some kind of frozen conflict or semi-frozen conflict, with Russia keeping grab of at least some chunk of Ukrainian territory for a while. And it's hard for me to imagine that under those circumstances, you could ever get the US or the EU to seriously scale back sanctions. So other than, a change of regime in Russia, Putin is gone, there is some new regime that is of a very different ilk. I don't see that return to normalcy. I think that one of the questions that this analysis begs is, can we keep the sanctions in, effectively have no serious economic relationship with Russia, but still at some point deal with issues that we need to deal with them on, like strategic stability, like nuclear arms control, things to prevent a wider conflict between NATO and Russia. But given where we are in Ukraine, I think any return to economic normalcy is far off in the future.
I mean, this is a kind of microcosm of the debate over de-risking with China, in a sense. I mean, it's slightly different, but not entirely. Do you want to, even if we don't, there's a lot that we could complain about and a lot that we don't want to excuse. I agree with Charlie about the near, maybe to medium term, but over the longer term, I mean, is it a safer world if you have no economic interdependence and a completely free-floating relationship when it comes to strategic stability, nuclear understandings about nuclear strategy, all of this sort of stuff? Probably not. Over the longer term, can you simply ignore this relationship? Again, probably not. And I think a lot more than in the United States, a lot in Germany, many other places in Europe, even in France, despite the toughening of attitudes, are looking ahead to that, because there's a long history there. There's a long history there.
No, I completely agree, and I think that looking down the road, I mean, arms control between the U.S. and Russia is currently dead. It's currently dead. It's not even on life support. However, can be, as soon as there's potential for negotiations, if there is potential for negotiations, arms control gets resurrected, because that is the foundation for which you have these sorts of conversations. And at that point, then, if you are on a road to building a more stable relationship, then the energy side, I think down that road could potentially be a topic, but there's a long path, I think, to head in that direction. So, but with that, we'll take, hands popped up in the last second. We have a few more minutes. Amy, we will take two. And then,
question primarily for Charlie, but also maybe Ian, if he's willing to answer it, which is, where do you think we stand in terms of deterrence? Has the United States lost its ability to create a deterrence internationally? Do we have a deterrent? Do you see we have an active deterrence in the balance with Russia? And did you see the exchange between Israel and Iran directly as a manifestation of the fact that the United States global deterrence is faltering, or you think that's too pessimistic?
Why don't we take the second question?
Thank you. We've talked about the Europe's diversification of gas in terms of LNG shifts. I think there's still an issue, though, with regards to the nature of that diversification strategy. And it relates to the fact that the West has put a tremendous amount of effort in developing the southern gas corridor. And the plans are to expand that corridor and to increase supplies from Azerbaijan, which of course also runs the risk of, in a sense, Russia's actions in Georgia in the future and what that might mean for the security of those supplies, as well as the issues related to what to do about Turk Stream and Russia's control over Turk Stream, which is important in terms of their leverage over Serbia and Hungary. So I was wondering, in that context, do you have any sort of thoughts about that aspect of diversification and how important it is to continue down that route? And is there anything we can do about Turk Stream and Turkey?
Yeah, great questions. And Charlie, we'll start with you, and we'll go through with each panelist. And I encourage everyone to be brief so we can stay on schedule. So, Charlie.
Yeah, to the question about deterrence, I think the American deterrent is in pretty good shape for the following several reasons. One is that I think the policy toward Ukraine has been about right, in the sense that Biden made the judgment early on that Ukraine was not worth World War III, and that we were therefore not going to go to war with Russia or enforce a no-fly zone or do other things that would put U.S. forces in direct conflict with Russian forces. But we've gone pretty far in helping Ukraine defend itself. The country still holds 80+% of its territory, and I'm guessing now that more aid is going to arrive, it will be able to hold the line. You've got NATO, 2 new members, a lot more firepower and capability on the eastern flank. I think that the Chinese have been watching what's happened to Russia for invading Ukraine, and they don't like that story. They don't want to go down that rabbit hole. I think the response of the West to the Russian invasion of Ukraine makes a Chinese attack against Taiwan less likely. And the Biden administration's efforts to tighten the alliance system, South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, AUKUS deal with Australia, I would say that broader extended deterrence is in pretty good shape. I'll defer on the energy questions to Anna and Ian.
I think the diversification is progressing. As I said, yes, the Turkish stream is working full throttle. And the Azeri gas is flowing as well. There has been a push from the European Union to bring more of that gas. But the question is a question of financing additional pipelines and building them. And for Azerbaijan to do it, it would have to have the assurance that that gas is going to be sold for and bought for a long time to be. Whereas European Union's policies are such that they want to, have this only as transitional fuel. So there is this disconnect. Probably European Union would have to finance most, if not all of it, in order for this to happen. That I guess remains to be seen. Although, thanks to a relatively successful kind of last 2 years of no serious energy crisis, it seems to me less likely than it was at the very beginning when Europe signed several agreements with Azerbaijan. There's also the issue of potentially leaking of Russian gas through other sources, including through Azerbaijan, who just signed a contract for 1 BCM of gas with Russia, right? So it's a matter of displacement. So these things could happen. However, there are serious diversification efforts. The Kirk terminal that's expanding with Hungary, bringing in quite a lot of that degasified fuel to its borders, as well as the Greek terminal, and then increasing interconnections, both in terms of electricity as well as gas interconnections between different countries. So Poland, Ukraine, Poland, Slovakia, and Lithuania actually has been just connected with Poland through the through pipeline, which is like the first connection on land connection between the Baltic republics and the rest of Europe with gas. So that's important, and that the interconnections will help diversification because it will help balance the system. So you don't have to have as much of gas, but you can move it around.
Maybe just a last thought on the deterrence question. I would agree with Charlie that I think overall, as a kind of net assessment, that we're still in a relatively, we, the West, if you like to say, NATO is still in a relatively strong position when it comes to deterrence. If you're thinking about deterrence in terms of deterring a direct Russian threat to NATO territory beyond the war in Ukraine, if you like, or even thinking about it in terms of the situation in Ukraine, perhaps, but certainly in terms of a further territorial threat to Europe, I find that pretty hard to contemplate. I think he is deterred in that sense. What I do worry about are two other things. I worry about things going wrong, as I said earlier, inadvertent escalation, miscalculations, accidents, and the longer the conflict goes on, the accumulated risk of this, it seems to me, is very significant, directly implicating NATO. The other piece about it is that as this goes on, we know less and less about Russian intentions. We're not learning more. The questions are just piling up. And I have to assume, not that we're trying to be mysterious, that who knows, he may have the same feeling about us. During the Cold War, we knew very well. We had a very good understanding about what was stabilizing and what was destabilizing. We may not have agreed about the outcome we wanted in the world, but there were no mysteries there, really. And now we have lots of mysteries and lots of potential for miscalculation. And I would worry about that more than the sort of fundamentals of deterrence. Although, again, we never really priced in ruthlessness as an element to deterrence, and that's clearly what we confront today.
Well, I really want to thank you all. I think it was a fascinating conversation. As someone who's been in Washington for 20 years, if this conversation happened 20 years ago, I think we've been fixated on the Middle East, on Gulf oil, and I think it sort of demonstrates how the conversation has really evolved when it comes to energy security and geopolitics. But please join me in thanking our panelists. And we will be taking a short break as we transition, and then we'll be back for our final panel on supply chains.
All right. Welcome back, everyone. Again, I'm Joseph Mikett. I'm the Director of the Energy Security and Climate Program here at CSIS. I'm very excited to round out what has been an incredible day. We're going from the risks associated with cybersecurity and EVs to the nature of the U.S.'s deterrent power and its relationship with Russia. We've covered a lot of ground. And on this last panel, I think we want to start talking about one of the key concepts that we heard right at the start of the day, right? The story of the last 2 years in Europe has been a shift toward renewables is seen as a way off of Russian gas dependence. There is concern held by many that you then kind of trade one dependence for another, right? Especially given supply chain concentration in China with respect to a lot of the goods of the clean energy economy. And so I've got 3 people here to talk about that issue, how real those risks are, and what we can actually do about them in a practical and economical way. And we're all going to benefit from their expertise. Directly to my left is Roger Martella. He's the Chief Sustainability Officer at General Electric Vernova. And Roger has a long and storied career as General Counsel at the US EPA and the DOJ. And he's got, I think, a lot to share with us on this kind of nature of what these supply chains are going to look like in the future. Andrew Wills is the Senior Vice President for Federal Affairs at Invenergy, a large energy company with a global footprint. Andrew's also bringing is bringing prior government experience. He was the Chief of Staff for Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response at the US DOE until just about a year ago. Is that correct? That's right. Great. So I'm very excited to hear your thoughts on this in this regard. And then Elena Giacopoulou is the Chief Strategy Officer at PPC. Elena's got a long career working out of Europe in the energy finance and analysis space, including a stint at BNEF. So thank you all for joining us. I want to actually start with Elena, and then we're going to work our way this way. Trading one dependence for another. From the perspective of a utility, how should public policymakers and analysts think about the risks that you guys see and what you're planning for in the medium term and the long term with respect to sort of the shifting nature of supply chains and the shifting energy mix?
First of all, thank you for the question. It's exciting to hear everything that has been said earlier on. Let me start with energy security in the sense that the system is changing. It was said, everyone knows that we move from a fuel-based system to a technology-based one, but this change is not happening overnight in the sense that you need to manage the risks and the complexities, both of a fuel-based system, because we are still using fossil fuels, and as we are planning our transition to a technology-based one where materials, equipment, manufacturing capacity, critical raw materials are key. In this sense, it's all right? Okay, yeah, okay, good. As a utility, of course, we are trying to diversify our portfolio. We are trying both in terms of technologies and in terms of geographies, because there is a lot of complementarity that we can leverage if we operate in different systems. And of course, this has a big impact on the energy security of a country and a region like Europe. But at the same time, what is very, very important for us to understand is how there is stability in the region in order to make sure that A, we have access to the equipment and we are not going to experience a similar situation at a very high cost that we experienced in 2022. And secondly, that there are the economic signals on the market that will keep us going with our investment, that will contribute to the net zero transition that Europe has set as a target.
So let's jump to Andrew. Andrew, you were looking at the sort of this security of supply for the U.S. when you were at the DOE. Now you're working in the private sector. How do you rate these different things? Our conversation today has gone from sort of like availability of materials in the critical mineral space to the sort of mechanisms necessary for clean energy to then cybersecurity. Where do you kind of see the emerging definition of energy security going?
Yeah, at DOE, thanks for the question. At DOE, we spent a lot of time thinking about how do you define energy security, because it really could be all things, which you just said it is all things. But you can also try to pave a narrower path. It reminds me when we were talking about the term resiliency. What does resiliency mean and who owns it? It's kind of hard to describe about what it is. And I think the same thing is true for energy security. We at Invenergy, I think, for those of you who don't know, and I didn't see this morning, we're a clean energy developer, owner and operator based in Chicago. We're definitely the U.S.'s largest and probably the world's largest private clean energy company. And I think our owner, Michael Polsky, has done a good job at following where this is needed, following where there's a demand, following the market signals. When he built the company in the early 2000s, it was PURPA had just changed the markets, and so we were building gas. And then the credits came along and he was building wind. And now we're at a place where we really have to look at sort of all of the above. And so that's what we're doing. We have gas assets. And right now here domestically, we're really focusing on getting power from where we have it, which is, as we all know, for renewables, usually in rural areas where there's not a lot of people, to where we need it. And so we're focused on long distance, high voltage, direct current transmission. To your question from the experience at DOE, I don't even want to try to quantify or qualify risks. I think they're all important, and I think we have to be paying attention to all of them at the same time.
And then let's come to Roger. And, Vernova, is it GE or Vernova?
GE Vernova.
GE Vernova is it's an equipment supplier, right? So, a lot of the political narrative is we move to a world of wind and solar. The resources are right here. The supply chain is like very, very short. But that's perhaps a hollow transition if you don't have the ability to have the inverters, the wind turbines, the nacelles, all of the equipment necessary to scale up that clean energy economy. GE's in the space. Like what do you see as government activity in with regard to these risks? Are they well characterized? And then how do we resolve them economically?
Well, Joseph, first of all, thanks for hosting us
Thank you
and
for
inviting us and having this critical conversation at this critical time. And I guess there's two things. So GE Vernova is a company that innovates the technology that helps produce 30% of the world's energy.
Right.
Very diversified, renewable energy, conventional power, grid equipment, and then breakthrough technologies like small modular reactors, carbon capture, hydrogen. So we're kind of in the whole supply chain in over 100 countries, 30% of the world's energy, 80,000 employees. And I guess maybe two things I'd say. I think one thing about energy security, frankly, I wish we didn't have to be here, have a conversation on energy security. I think we'd all prefer that.
Well,
but it has driven, I think, a return to pragmatism when it comes to the grid and power. A few years ago, it was like picking winners and losers, and we didn't like that. And we were very much on the record, like we think it's still all of the above. And I think we've seen, as a result of the focus on energy security, this return to pragmatism, where we're not picking one versus others, come to more of all of the above, government policies aligning to that, a couple exceptions out there. We think that's a positive thing. From a supply chain perspective, though, that is where the challenge, whether you're talking about renewables, gas power, nuclear, and these breakthrough technologies, energy security, Ukraine has been a wake-up call, even for us. Like when we stepped up with Ukraine, we wanted to, and we continue to be one of the strongest partners to make sure nothing is more important to us than keeping the lights on in Ukraine. But we started to realize right away, like we don't have this equipment sitting on shelves. We don't have it in some warehouse or an inventory. When we look around, we have years and years of backlog. We're talking with some of our colleagues here about delivering technology 2020, 2027, 28, 29, 30. And so we came to this fundamental, like this is not only an energy security issue, it's a national security issue. Are we ready for whether it's cybersecurity, weather events, the growing demand, and all this infrastructure to be able to address this? So we're having very serious kind of boardroom level discussions, as well as with our public sector colleagues from a national security imperative. How do we make sure we have a supply chain? How do we have strategic reserves of this types of equipment? Because we have years of backlog, and how do we build that capacity? We have to be fast and we have to be smart. So we're at the beginning era of that, but I do think because of energy security, we've woken up to this reality that the current situation is not sustainable. The capacity is critical, and we need to solve for that both in collaboration with the private sector and the public sector.
So let's turn to the transatlantic cooperation a little bit if we can. I mean, a big part of the story from the last 2 years was U.S. LNG can arrive in Europe and really helped resolve the crisis that Europe faced. And that, that was not a cost-free thing, but it by and large worked. Now, but it was like a market-driven thing. Like politicians on both sides want to claim a lot of credit for it, but largely it happened through the price mechanism. So I'd be really interested to hear, Roger, kind of how you see transatlantic cooperation or kind of strategic allies working together to build the kind of capacity you describe, right? Whether it's manufacturing capacity, whether it's stockpiling equipment, what are the places of activity we should look for? Where does the government need to set its efforts?
Well, I think there's a lot of good discussions going on. There's a lot of transatlantic coordination at the highest levels of government among really smart people. And Europe, UK, US, I think they see the energy security issue. I think they see the national security issue. And there's a lot of questions about China's opportunities and advantages and how do we prepare ourselves for that. So we've gotten very strong advocacy, cooperation, collaboration from partners on all sides. Now, it's not a level playing field when it comes to policy between the US and the EU. It has swung. The EU has historically led in the space. I think everybody understands that. The US has the momentum with the Inflation Reduction Act. We see more EU companies wanting to build factories here than we see US companies kind of running to the EU. We want to address that. And I think to the credit of the European Union, they were kind of antagonistic in the early days of the Inflation Reduction Act. Now they're like, help us understand what we can learn from the US so we can duplicate that here. How do we build that domestic supply chain? How do we create those incentives? It may be a little different. And we're very, very happy to have that conversation. We don't think this should be a US-centric effort. And now we see the flow of information going back that way. So it's not just about deploying technology in Ukraine, LNG, and other places. How do we build that strong economic base in the EU supply chain workforce development so that they get the same economic opportunities and benefits? So that's a big focus at the moment.
I mean, we love to see Europeans go from annoyed with Americans to inspired by Americans, right?
Not that they would admit it.
But then, the question becomes, how do we avoid duplicative effort, right? We don't want to be competing against each other to build the wind turbines or, the components for inverters or, so that's where I think the kind of government to government communication is going to become essential. So we're not in this kind of battle for, who can be the most protectionist, who's going to win the subsidy fight, but that we're sort of coordinating or complementing each other based on strengths. Andrew, I'd love to bring you into this conversation as well, given Invenergy's footprint, kind of how do you see the private sector playing a role in helping to kind of create demand for that kind of cooperation?
Yeah, no, I love that question, and I think that is happening. We don't have to do anything about it at this point. I think the government incentives through the IRA have already inspired, along with ESG efforts and other kind of just demand from customers. You're seeing companies that want to invest in this technology and in this new power. And I think that is kind of like the rising tide that sort of lifts all boats. So we already are seeing the demand. Now it's just a matter of executing, and that's where people like Roger and his team and his folks at GE are helping. Invenergy, I think I mentioned to you earlier, Invenergy built this year a solar manufacturing facility that is the country's largest single-site solar manufacturing facility of modules in Ohio, and we're producing by the end of the year 5 gigawatts of solar modules. It's going to take a long time to onshore the whole supply chain for solar, but I do think there's an opportunity for folks like Assistant Secretary Pyatt over at the State Department and his team to work collaboratively with other nations and how we can sort of friendshore our components that are needed. Because to your point, we can't duplicate these efforts. It takes too long to build a polysilicon factory and a wafering and ingoting facility and a cell manufacturing facility. We can't duplicate. We have to do it together.
Elena, I'd love to bring you back into the conversation on sort of how you see the conversation evolving with your peers in Europe and with European policymakers as well, with respect to, sort of being inspired by the IRA, but also sort of, here in the U.S. there's a lot of hesitancy around Chinese-dominated supply chains. I think in Europe the picture's a little more mixed. Kind of what's the state of play right now?
So what we need to keep in mind is that the targets we have in Europe to satisfy our climate ambitions require to almost triple renewable energy installed capacity and by 2030 and increase fivefold by 2050. So we need a lot of equipment and we need a lot of critical materials that will be used to manufacture this equipment, and we will need them on time and at the right price from a utilities point of view, right? So we are only one investment cycle away from 2030, which means that we definitely appreciate the lessons learned from the recent crisis, and we definitely understand that there is a need to find a pathway forward that combines both climate targets and energy security. And we are increasingly, the utilities, working closer with the industry. But at the same time, our asking from policymakers is that in order for us to play our part, we need to make sure that we have supply chains in place, the resiliency in place, the equipment in place, and I will say that again, at the right price. Because affordability has always been an issue when we talk about energy security, when we talk about climate transition, and from the utilities point of view as well, we can't just ignore it. The Green Industrial Plan has been the response of Europe to the IRA. I totally appreciate that it's not a matter of competitiveness, who can do it better, but it's a matter how you can join forces and make sure you deliver on time what we need in order to meet our targets. But these are the important aspects for a utility to make sure that we have enough panels, enough wind turbines, enough batteries. Right. And of course, this need to come together with the permitting framework. It has been a huge issue in Europe, permitting, how you reduce red tape, and right. you keep deploying. And of course, grid cables are extremely important in order to make sure that electricity flows around the continent, right. and that you leverage the resources that you have in the different parts of Europe, and to make sure that you reduce over-reliance to anything right. as a continent, not at the country level.
So this question is to the group, because I'm honestly just curious. As we, you think about this supply chain concentration, that really is, it's largely a China conversation. What are the components that we should be thinking about, right? Like, is it the wind turbine? Is it batteries? Is it solar modules? For each of you, kind of what are the ones what are the essential pieces you think we need to kind of like focus on from a security perspective? And then we can talk about the other things, sort of the industrial policy, the political economy of transition. Just from a security, which components are you worried about?
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yes, sir.
Do you mean cybersecurity, physical security, supply chain
I was
security?
aiming to be ambiguous on that, just to
intentionally, probably.
But let's we talked a lot earlier today about cyber, so we could let's start at cyber, and then physical. I feel like we've kind of covered, and then talking about sort of where is there supply chain risk that might be familiar from the oil and gas space, right? Where you're worried in a rising geopolitical conflict, we're just going to lose access to a critical component of the energy system. Cyber, then
go.
supply.
Okay.
I'm going to speak to one before cyber, but I'll start with something I think that is a huge, something we're facing here in the United States quite a bit, is load growth. Whether it's from data centers that are coming to the United States, or whether it's from electric vehicles or electrification of appliances, or any number of things that is bringing electricity usage up. we here in the United States have to have additional capacity. We just can't deal with no capacity to meet load or meet demand. And so, that brings me back to transmission, which I could talk to you all day about transmission, but that's not why I'm here. Create wires to connect disparate regions is incredibly important. On cybersecurity, I think all of the components are at issue. All of the components of energy infrastructure at this point is connected. I'd say the more points of connection, the more vectors for cyber interference you have. So we really have to be mindful about that. I think my former employer, NERC, is doing a good job at the sort of bulk power system of mandating cybersecurity standards. But when you get behind the meter and even at the distribution level, there really isn't a whole lot of conversation being had there, quite possibly because the information sharing isn't really happening. But on supply chain, I'd say, yeah, I'm going to leave it there, actually. I'm going to stop. Okay. Get off my soapbox.
Yeah. Others? I mean, is it even a well-posed question? Maybe I'm like, maybe the componentry question is less important than I think.
I think it's a critical question, and I'm going to go to Ukraine because I think Ukraine is going through the energy transition right now, and we've been partnering with them shoulder to shoulder with Jeff Pyatt, with our great partners in the government. Let's look at what's happened in Ukraine. First thing Ukraine needs in an emergency situation is emergency power. And so we make a product called an aeroderivative turbine. Imagine a jet engine connected to a generator on the back of a trailer bed that you can move, truck trailer that you can move around strategically, powers about 100,000 homes connected to a natural gas line. Ukraine could use all of these aeroderivative turbines. We can get them. The problem is, in an era of an energy transition, climate change, we have two challenges. They're extremely high demand because everyone in the world wants to have these ready to go to solve droughts, weather conditions all around the world. And two, they rely on jet engines, which involves critical minerals. So we have huge supply chain issues. So what we're trying to do with Ukraine is go to our customers and say, we're sorry, we know you really need this, but Ukraine needs it more. How can we balance that supply chain in real time? We're managing this down day by day with these inventories. So job number one is emergency power, not as easy as it sounds. And in Ukraine, they're literally running generators sometimes to keep the lights on. The second would be grid synchronization equipment. How do you enable a grid that's impacted by a weather event in Ukraine? It's because of targeting of bombing by Russia and things like that, to connect with other parts of the grid. Again, not sitting on shelves, very high demand, and years of backlog. The third category I'd say would be just regular transformers, auto transformers, and how do you replace something? We had an issue in North Carolina. Someone was going around shooting up transformers with a gun. Who would have thought? And how do you have a strategic supply ready to go? So we could go further than that, whether wind and other technologies. But if we look at Ukraine in the early days of this energy transition, energy security issue, those have been the demand drivers in the near term to keep the lights on.
Yeah. Elena, do you have thoughts?
What I would like to add is that, of course, there is a need for everything. I mean, everything in terms of components and technologies. And there is then the special category of equipment that is available, which is the Chinese panels. They are available, but then, especially because of what happened with Russia, you want to diversify. So there is an issue, not because there is not enough equipment, but because you want a diversification strategy that makes sure that you won't go down the pathway of over-reliance. And as you said at the beginning, you're switching one with another. So it's on all ends. It's not pick one technology and tackle this problem.
And one of the things I think is an open question for a lot of us in the analytical community and in the private sector is kind of like, how do we even think about over-reliance in that case, right? Like the intuitions we have from sort of the oil space are just probably not the right ones to use here. And so one of the things we're hoping to do in this over the next year and a half with this project is think through, like, how do we actually kind of measure resilience in a meaningful way, right? Is it the ability to spin up manufacturing when there's supply challenges? Is a certain level of diversity enough? I think that's going to be some of the key questions that we have to face. Roger, I want to return to you because, as a manufacturer, one of the, if I we kind of put my libertarian analyst hat on for a moment, I go, well, this is all going to be really expensive, right? And part of the story here of globalized supply chains is it makes things cheaper, and that's good for consumers, and it's good for the energy transition. So how should we think about the government doing the right amount of effort to really bring down costs, to make this an affordable transition and a secure one at the same time?
You hit on one of the key points, and you were asking about transatlantic factories in the U.S., factories in Europe. Let me just point out, this is not a transatlantic issue necessarily. It's also a domestic issue. Everybody wants the cell factory. Everybody wants their blade factory. And one thing, the Biden administration has had to go state to state and say, nope, you get this and you get that. And we've had to spread out the supply chain because it's entirely economically inefficient for the private sector and the public sector. As Andrew pointed out, to keep, repeating all these technologies. And what we'd like to do is, we don't want to build something in the U.S. and ship it to other parts of the world necessarily. We want the whole world kind of invested, not only in the opportunities from energy, nothing's more important than affordable, sustainable, reliable electricity, but have the economic developments of that too, the work chain development, going into underserved communities and making sure that we're inspiring people who otherwise don't have access to a STEM education to be inspired to become STEM leaders. So this increasingly, and I'd like to say we're doing it because we want to do it. We're committed to doing this, but I'd also like to say, I think increasingly we have to do it. If we're going to be a global company working with global partners, they should expect this from us. Where do they fit in the supply chain? They may not get that in a cell factory, but they could get a critical component that helps us, do this very efficiently all around the world. And the public sector has to help us. Like, we have domestic content requirements in the U.S. on the Inflation Reduction Act. Fine, but they've defined those in a way, it's not 100% domestic content. Making sure that we're helping our partners grow their supply chain, but they're also cautious about China too. So I think they're finding that balance, and we should continue to be very pragmatic in how we find that balance going forward.
Interesting. Elena, from the European perspective, how do you think about that? The challenge, or what are European policymakers looking at? Like, I know STEM education is a big priority for you, right? When you hear this kind of we have this term here in the U.S., it's like industrial policy is like an everything bagel, right? It's trying to deliver everything. How are some of those challenges being considered in the European context? Not challenges, but a lot of those factors.
There are three components when it comes to any industrial, I think, when it comes to any industrial success. So you need the scale, you need the global scale, you need the innovation, and then you need the financial support in order to build something that is can deliver. So these days, and with the REPowerEU, the European Union has said very clearly the end target and what's the goal, where we want to go. When it comes to technologies and how exactly the industrial activity will be supported, I think it's not that clear. It's a bit, there are so many technological options. There is a certain amount of money that can support these technologies, and it's not infinite. There's definitely a number there that cannot make everything competitive and successful and at the right amount and at the right price made in Europe. And I think that's where these discussions that are increasing over time with the US about the IRA and how we bring these two frameworks together and we leverage the best out of it. We are, as you know, right before the European elections, so we will have a new commission. The items on the agenda are very clear with the Industrial Act, the Critical Minerals Act, how grids will be supported and how we'll deliver the 2030 and 40 targets. But I think that it's still out there, the journey on how we are going to work together and how exactly we are going to get the supply chains and the equipment that we need.
Andrew, I see you nodding, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this kind of same question.
Yeah, of course. The question you asked was, what is the right amount of government effort needed? And it reminds me, one of the things we worked on when I was at DOE was transformers. If you're tracking domestic manufacturing and domestic supply chains, you know that transformers is a critical issue, whether you're talking about distribution transformers, which was actually a very acute issue here domestically. You're talking about what we call LPTs, or large power transformers that are made for the transmission network. There was a huge discussion about creating a strategic reserve for transformers, and it's probably still an active conversation if I had to guess. The Hill asked about it, and the administration asked about it, and the industry asked about it some, but everybody kind of agreed that because our system in the United States is so big, different specifications between the Western interconnect and the Eastern interconnect, very slight difference in frequency, there just really wasn't the ability to have a supply chain or a reserve that served everybody's needs. So you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars to maybe meet some niche gap when it's needed. And I think the administration has done a good job of sort of putting forward a strategy that I think is the right strategy, which is to onshore this stuff and to friendshore this stuff so we don't have to have a strategic transformer reserve, so we have it in our backyards. The IRA incentives, they're fantastic. It allows more capacity for us to manufacture goods domestically and work with our partners. I'd also note that it's not just limited to the United States. I mentioned this earlier in a conversation, but because of the IRA, companies like Invenergy, a private company, have been able to invest abroad as well. We have 2 offices in Madrid. We've got projects in Japan, Poland, UK, Uruguay, Brazil, Mexico, Canada. We're able to do that because of the success we've had domestically, and I'd argue that in some respects is because of investments made even by the IRA. I also agree with Roger about the balance between decoupling from China and pushing forward our manufacturing efforts here domestically. There has to be a balance. It can't be just to throw everything out. China has developed a manufacturing capacity that nobody else in the world has. We've kind of ceded that leadership a long time ago, and now it's time to bring that back to our shores in the United States and, of course, the shores of all of you represented here in the room.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask one final question to the panel, but I want to bring the audience in. So give it a thought of what you want to get out of these folks, and we'll turn to you in a moment. But a lot of what we are trying to help states do is like a risk management problem, right? Sort of how do we assess these supply chain risks? How do we incorporate them? How do we kind of bring in the cyber and physical risks that we've spent a lot of time today talking about? Risk management also gives us the ability to try and hedge, right? And so when I think about this challenge, I think, well, it's just as Andrew says, how do you compete on solar manufacturing with China? It's like, that might be hard, expensive to do. But as Roger brings in, there's a whole bunch of other technologies that we know we need for deep decarbonization that are going to be part of the future energy system that nobody really has ownership of yet. So how do we look at this risk management problem also as an opportunity to kind of see investment flow to places where we know we need to see further technological development? And how do you, Roger, how's GE thinking about that? How do you think about it? And how can we help the US and European governments think about that sort of, kind of hedging strategies for these risks?
It's something that weighs on me every day. And so thank you for asking. And look, if we were sit here today and if we could lock in the policy frameworks or the direction, the momentum is happening, I think we'd feel quite optimistic that, maybe we're not 100% there. We've got some guidances coming out of the Biden administration, and the EU has some work to do, but it seems like things are headed in the right direction. But we all know that nothing is a straight line. And companies do best on this type of investment when there's certainty. And so from a risk perspective, we see a lot of uncertainty. Our board sees a lot of uncertainty. We see uncertainty. And so we're managing for the uncertainty. We're hedging for the uncertainty. And we see that the trends are moving in the right direction: the energy security, innovation, technology, manufacturing, jobs. Regardless of what you might think on politics, everyone should be behind all those concepts, but then there becomes the question on how you execute on that. Right. So we're constantly looking to encourage our government stakeholders on all sides of the issues. If you care about energy security, if you care about jobs, manufacturing, beating China, innovation, technology, you should care about sending clear signals of certainty to the business environment. And the other thing you could do is think about some of the roadblocks and the obstacles, whether permitting reform, some of the finance issues. How do you streamline workforce development, the things in the way? I was impressed with a lot of things at COP28 in the UAE. And one of the things I walked away with, someone who's been in this space for 30 years, is just like how much easier it is to get things done in certain parts of the world. Like, we know it's not easy here, and it's not easy in Europe, but there's places where it's just really easy. And maybe that's good for some things. You want them to pilot projects, and that's fine, and we can do that in a collaborative way. But at some point, that's just going to attract a lot of inevitable investment and attention if you can do something in 3 months, whether it would take 2 years or 3 years, and litigation uncertainty here. So I think we have to solve for those risks at the same time.
So as an example of that kind of certainty, like the global pledge to build triple nuclear capacity, and which is a place where there's potentially a lot of innovation. It doesn't feel like anybody really owns that space at the moment, especially in the SMRs.
Or Andrew talked about hydrogen hubs and carbon capture hubs. Those are great. We love where DOE's headed with that. We love where Congress is headed with that. But now is the EPA going to issue the permits fast enough? Is there going to be litigation around those things? And versus other places where they might be like, okay, we're doing a hydrogen hub, so so here's our schedule, we're sticking to it. And so we have to be careful about the relative advantages of those types of situations.
And Elena, and what are your thoughts on this kind of like, like the sort of the big innovation problems associated with a net zero economy, and how do you where do you see European efforts, since so much of the U.S. conversation is now on hydrogen and carbon capture and small modular reactors?
Definitely, there is a lot of focus on what we like to call the phase 2 of deep decarbonization technologies, where things are not settled. So hydrogen has been a focus for Europe the last few years, for PVC as well. Green hydrogen, the electrolysis, I mean, there is a lot of plans for ramping up capacity for manufacturing electrolyzers in Europe. And there are special schemes where they allow us to test things at a smaller scale. There are these projects of common interest we have in Europe, with quite a few projects around hydrogen, and especially addressed to the hard-to-abate sector. So maritime is hungry about what they're going to do, industrial players a lot. So there is definitely room there, and the frameworks are setting up. I just think from a utilities point of view, of course, we are trying smaller things, smaller projects, decentralized projects, something that it's not going at the core of the system, but we test things on the side and we can see how this can be rolled out while the market is set up, because the challenge there is A, to set up the market, and B, to come up, to make sure that we have the equipment and it's working and there is permitting and that everything around is set. So we are trying pilot projects around Europe. There is a lot of hype around hydrogen. I think this might be scaled down a bit next year or so, because it's not just the economics are hard, but it's also that it's very expensive and it's very difficult technically to transfer molecules compared to electrons. But I think that definitely there is a lot of room for trial and error, and there is time there that will allow all of the different sectors to line up and deliver. And there is a great opportunity in terms of equipment, but I don't want to get there. This is not really my area.
Well, I'm really grateful that you use, like, one of the terms that you use there is, right, trial and error and learning. And I was just reading the book Fixing the Climate again with my students. So Charlie Sable and David Victor wrote this like really impactful book, at least for me, on kind of how climate policy actually works. And one of the key themes is like learning, right? Experimentalism ends up being very, very important in helping firms and countries make these kind of like existential choices about what their energy portfolio is going to look like, what their business is going to look like in the face of needing to build a net zero world, needing to improve energy security. And that, it becomes a key and important part of industrial policy.
It does, and if there is an advantage that we have in Europe is that we have a lot of countries with different energy mix and with different pathways to get to net zero, which allows us to try some things around. Right. I mean, you have France, of course, that has nuclear. You have the South that has a lot of solar. So there are different microsystems, if you wish, that they can try different things and see at the end of the day what are the solutions that could work and could fly, and what are the ones that wouldn't.
Yeah, that's excellent. I'm really looking forward to continuing to work in that space. And then, of course, we collect all those different microcosms with a large grid and a lot of grid infrastructure, and then we can share efficiency and resilience. Let me open to the floor as folks have questions on this regard. There should be a microphone going around. Brief reminder, questions have a propositional statement, followed by a sentence that goes up at the end.
On the subject of cybersecurity, most of the discussion today, all of it probably, seemed to assume that the vulnerability was coming from hostile governments. How would you compare and contrast that qualitatively and quantitatively with the vulnerability to non-governmental actors, whether it's hostile private groups operating abroad or a bunch of kids amusing themselves, whatever?
Trying to speak high level enough that I'm not sharing anything I probably shouldn't share. I'd say it's a good point, and I'd say certainly leans towards state actors. But you're right, there is a real threat even from non-state connected actors.
Can I just address that?
Yeah, please,
And
please.
I think it's a
No,
critical
over
point because the technology should be agnostic on that, right? And then we have to make sure we have both digital and physical tools.
Technology
prepared.
countermeasures.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bob Eichert, Atlantic Council. I'd like to get your perspective on wind from a sort of a supplier, investor, utility perspective. Because we've had this downward curve, and then all of a sudden we got hit with supply chain disruption, inflation, higher financing costs, et cetera, and it's really affected the offshore wind in particular, not only in Europe and the US, but around the world as well. So, I mean, is it going to change? And why?
It's an excellent question. Tough days, or I mean, in preparing for this conference, I read that wind surpassed gas for the first time across Europe as a primary energy source. So, challenges in the wind industry.
Onshore wind, I think, has found its footing. Good trajectory there. Inflation Reduction Act, partially responsible for that. But even without the Inflation Reduction Act, we're seeing the right market signals to give onshore wind long-term sustainability support. You're right about offshore. That's probably been the hardest thing that we do. I think history, if I had to make a prediction, we'll look at 2023 and say that was the toughest year. That was the year the whole industry had to reset, the market had to reset, everybody's expectations had to reset. We're only in April of 2024, but I'd like to think history is going to look back and say 2024 was the year it turned around. The market, the OEMs, the governments came together, they learned from that, and we start to see a forward trajectory. So still hard, very hard, perhaps the hardest thing we're doing, but I see the positive momentum, and that's been a result of both government, the public sector and the private sector having to make some really difficult decisions in the last 18 months or so.
Financing rates are a big barrier now, or not?
We're starting to see the pricing start to get closer. We're getting in the universe now where the pricing's making better sense for offshore wind. So we like the trajectory where that's headed.
Elena, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that question too, given that Greece has this enormous offshore wind resource. Beautiful views, kind of like, what are the, what are your thoughts on that?
We think that it's a technology still in its early days, the offshore wind. Especially in Greece, the potential can be leveraged using floating offshore wind because we have very deep water, and we understand that this is even in the earliest days, and it's going to be more expensive. We understand that, and it's going to need support. Like the same thing happened with the solar and the onshore wind back like 10 or 15 years ago. However, in Europe, we also have the EU ETS scheme, the carbon price. So we can't say that the competitiveness is that close, to be honest. I think that the crossover points are closer than here. The gas prices that we experience are also higher, are not as low as here. But definitely going back to my point about scale and what it takes for a technology, to get there and become competitive, we will need the scale from the manufacturer's point of view, but also offshore wind is a technology that will need support in order to become competitive and outcompete thermal on its own merit without any subsidies. And it's not just that, it's that offshore wind also needs the grid infrastructure. So going back to my point about the importance of enhancing grid, modernizing grids, and making sure that we have the infrastructure to leverage its full potential, it's critical. So it's not just the equipment, it's also everything else that comes around it.
Please, Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, on onshore, Roger's exactly right. I totally agree with him. If you read the American Clean Power Association reports and any EIA reports, you saw a huge dip in 2023 of onshore wind deployment, and it was precisely because COVID, inflation rates, supply chain. I think you're on your trajectory up. We have this price signal now with the Inflation Reduction Act for 10 years. We have we can rely on that tax credit for a long time to come, which we've never had before as an industry. On offshore, Invenergy owns an offshore wind lease in both California and in New York. So we're dealing with both floating and moored offshore wind, and can kind of see both perspectives. I think generally as an industry, offshore is going to take a long time to get right, but I do think you're starting to see it level out and balance out a little bit, where a lot of the contracts that were made for offshore wind facilities that are becoming a thing now were made at a time when the world looked a lot different than it does today. I think some of the ones, including Invenergy's agreement with New Jersey's BPU, are at a place where we can start really thinking about putting steel in the water. Now it's a matter of permitting, transmission, and Invenergy is developing a transmission line to take all of the offshore wind from the East Coast and put it in the PJM, permitting, siting, and all the other things that are going to go along with creating the industry.
Yeah, we can go over here, and while the microphone's in transit, I like that comment from Elena. The ETS does work. Carbon pricing has seen some challenging days here in the States, but it really does make a difference. Provides market certainty for our innovators. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for everything. Carol Penchina Cárdenas, previously CSIS, now at ASG. Centering on the definition of energy security, and thinking of all the geopolitical conflicts that we're having in the world, like we have a global north and a global south, and of course the definition of energy security is contingent to every country. But when thinking about defining the energy security of every country or different regions around the world, how do we differentiate it? Is it developed to non-developed? Is it the global south to non-global south? How do you think about the definition of each country? Thank you.
Okay, we have the experience of energy security issues. I mean, IEA, I think, has this definition that says it's all about availability, affordability, and accessibility. So you need to have access to energy resource at all times at a low price. As we are transitioning to a different world, and everyone is transitioning to a different world, right? Solar is cheap for everyone. You can see in the developing countries a lot of innovation happening, leapfrogging, and moving to a certain direction. There is this, 3As are replaced by decentralization, digitalization, decarbonization. So, and this comes with its own risks and its own vulnerabilities, but also with different opportunities. And because the technologies are global, different countries can enjoy the benefits of the same technologies that are, of the same technology. So I would say that the definition is the same for everyone, in my opinion. How you use the technology available and how you make your systems might differ, but the definition, I wouldn't say that different countries would have a different definition of energy security.
Yeah, and if I may add, I think one of the things that often gets conflated is energy security and sort of geopolitical factors, right? That you could be very energy secure, but totally geopolitically beholden. And and you could be, and so part of what I think governments are trying to do is navigate both of those things, right? That you don't want to sacrifice one for the other necessarily.
That's true, but there is a confusion sometimes. I think that energy secure means energy independent,
right?
Which is not the case. You need to have enough diversity and make sure that you have access at all time, not that you need to rely on your own resources.
Right, yeah. Let's take one final question, and then I think we can wrap up the day. Yep, here we go.
Thanks. Question is about stockpiling and what role you see for stockpiling in future energy security. The IEA at the moment with 90 days requirement for oil, to what extent can that be carried over? And perhaps particularly for supply chains where China is already dominant, and solar is the one that stands out for me, where it might make less sense for onshoring or friendshoring, and what role would you see for stockpiling? Thanks. I'm going to respond to two different answers. One, when I was at DOE, our office was in charge of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. I think there's a different answer for your question if you're talking about fuel supply. It just doesn't really, it's comparing fuel and technology, I think, is a little unfair comparison. So no position on stockpiling fuel in Europe or wherever, because I helped lead the stockpile here in the United States for that. The Chinese suppliers of products and sort of diversifying the
technological supply chain. I'm only going to speak to my experience at DOE when we had the transformer reserve idea. That was specific to the circumstances of transformer reserve. Those pieces of infrastructure are incredibly expensive, and they're outdated pretty quickly depending on the use case. But I won't opine on other technologies of stockpiling. I do think it's a good question to continue to ask, but I don't know that we as a country, at least from my vantage point, have had a conversation about pieces other than sort of large power.
Any thoughts to add on that question?
I think it's well said.
Okay. Well, let me, now I'm going to make them wait while I close out the whole conference. So they have to sit here for 10 minutes. No. On behalf of everybody at CSIS, let me thank our guests who've been here in person, our colleagues from joining online. We're really grateful that you lended your time. My colleague Max Bergman, on his behalf as well, I think we're really appreciative that everybody is engaged in this conversation with us. We're appreciative that PPC is in a position to help support this work. And we are very, very mostly grateful for the efforts of our experts. They took time out of our day to share their perspectives with us. Thank you very much. If you wouldn't mind, we can close with a warm round of applause for our speakers. And this is Joseph Mikett for CSIS signing off. We'll see you next time.